Chief Starrett, nice to see you. Casey, are we just waiting on the commissioner?
Yes, from the city side. Yep.
Yep. All right, well, we're just waiting on Commissioner Arnella to get started. And for folks on the second panel from the Pilot Action Group and folks from the institutional panel, just for managing the Zoom room, I'm keeping the second and third panel in the attendee space for now, but we'll move you over as we're moving on. I think we've got the commissioner now. Central staff, are we ready to go?
Ready to go when you are, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Chief Starrett, we all good on your side?
We are. Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, great. Excellent. Then I'm calling this hearing of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 Councilor. Sorry, I misspoke. It isn't the Ways and Means Committee. It's the Committee on Pilot Agreements, which I'm also the chair of, and which is in fact today having its inaugural hearing. We're very excited to be focusing on the question of community benefits agreements today. So today's hearing formally is on docket 0327, order for a hearing regarding increasing oversight, transparency, and coordination of pilot community benefits offsets. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will be rebroadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. We'll be taking public testimony at the end of the hearing. I know we've got some folks signed up already. If you want to testify here in the Zoom by video conference, you can just email Cora, so that's CORA .montrond, MONTROND @boston.gov. So cora.montrond @boston.gov. Cora will get you the link, and when you're called, we just ask that you state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to just a couple of minutes to ensure that all comments can be heard. We're also taking written testimony, which you can email to ccc.pilot@boston.gov. So that's ccc.pilot@boston.gov. And I want to thank the many folks who have submitted written testimony to us already. Please be assured that we are circulating that to all councilors, and it'll be read carefully. And I do appreciate we have a number of people who weren't able to join us today, but did submit fulsome comments. So thank you for that. Now, I'm joined by my colleagues, Councillor Liz Braden, District 9, Councillor Michelle Wu at large, and Councillor Ricardo Arroyo, District 5. So thank you to all of them for being here. Councillor Braden is my co-filer of this docket, along with then Council President, now Mayor Kim Janey. So grateful to Liz for her partnership. And just before we go to the administration, I'll just allow the councilors who are here to say a couple words in opening. Again, I'm Kenzie Bach. In addition to being the chair of this committee, I'm the District 8 councilor, which is a district that runs from the West End to Mission Hill and is proud to boast many amazing institutions, from universities to hospitals to cultural institutions. And for me, one of the core reasons that we filed this hearing order was because we've really seen in COVID and under duress what it looks like when our institutions in our city come together in a coordinated way to really tackle a crisis. And I think there are opportunities in a real, a best-in-class kind of pilot program nationwide to think about how we achieve that kind of synergy and sort of everybody pulling in the same direction to tackle some of our enduring crises, whether you're talking about racial and economic inequity, educational opportunity, housing unaffordability, all these things in the city. So I'm grateful to the many folks on all sides who've been talking and thinking about this, and hopeful that this is a conversation today that kind of catalyzes some meaningful action in that direction. So I'll pass it now to my colleague and co-filer, Councillor Liz Braden. Councillor Braden, you want to say a few words?
I will. I'll keep it brief because I want to hear, we want to move on to the panelists, but I want to thank you, Councillor Bach, and for chairing this session. I'm very pleased to be the lead sponsor of this hearing with you and with Mayor Ginny when she was then council president way back in February. I look forward to really continuing this work with Mayor Ginny's office and our institutional partners, community advocates, and members of the public. I want to particularly thank all the panelists today, including our administration representatives, the Pilot Action Group for all their great work, Conference on Boston Teaching Hospitals, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in Massachusetts, and the Boston Community Health Needs Assessment and the Community Health Improvement Planning Collaborative. I really feel strongly that if we all work together as stakeholders to ensure that properly renewed and transformed approaches to pilot community benefits, that the whole city will be beneficiaries of that. And it will help us address some of the underlying inequities in our communities, and also give some relief to our taxpayers who are the taxpayers in Boston are carrying 73% of the revenue for the city budget at the moment, and that's an unsustainable situation. So I hope that through our conversations that we can find a better way forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Braden. And I will just go to colleagues. I just ask everyone to keep opening statements brief so we can move to the panels. Councillor Michelle Wu at large.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bach and I were at the same event. I just ran in the door a little further away from than she is. So just want to very briefly say thank you so much to everyone. I know this has been an ongoing conversation for years at this point. I'm glad to see that the council is moving forward with the committee and more direct and specific oversight here. We need to see some major changes, especially in this moment, that reflect the sustainability of our revenue sources in the long run, and not just lean on the sort of one-time federal infusion of funds to put band-aids over what should be longer term structural conversations about our revenue. And this is a big piece of it. So thank you so much. Thank you for organizing, and to everyone for being part of this.
Great, thank you, Councillor Wu. Councillor Arroyo?
Thank you, Councillor Bach. I'm not sure if I'm coming through because it's a little bit jumpy, so I'm not sure how my service is in terms of
We can hear you. You're coming
Perfect.
through loud and clear.
All right, perfect. So I'm gonna keep the camera off and I'll keep it very short. I support the work that we're doing to enhance the pilot program and make sure that we're receiving the funding that we should be receiving, which we currently don't. And so I look forward to hearing from these panelists, and I'll leave it there so that we can get started because you got two panels going.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Arroyo. Councillor, one second, I lost my list. Councillor Andrea Campbell?
Thank you, Councillor Bach, and of course, thank you to the makers for this timely conversation. Thank you also to the advocates who sent some really thoughtful information, who've been working on this issue for some time. And so look forward to hearing the panelists. I'll keep it short and sweet, given that we're already 10 minutes in. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Campbell. Councillor Anissa Sabi-George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ditto.
Can't be beat. Fair. All right. And Councillor Lydia Edwards, District 1.
Thank you. I'm excited to get into the weeds of everything. We know we have a pending ordinance, and I think this is the perfect time to really restructure our relationship with the large institutions, our nonprofits and universities. So I will end it there. Looking forward to hearing from everybody.
Great, thank you so much. And now, without further ado, I'll pass it over to the administration, who we had asked to come and speak specifically to this topic of pilot agreements and specifically community benefits, and really thinking about how we make those most impactful for the residents of Boston and coordinate. So I've got here today with us our CFO, Justin Sterrett, along with our Commissioner of Assessing, Nick Arnello, and Casey, I've lost my cheat sheet with your title, but also Casey Brock-Wilson, an indispensable member of the team. Our Director of Strategic Partnerships for the City of Boston. All right, thanks. Chief Sterrett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Councillor. And thank you, Councillor, for inviting us here on this really important topic. And I think everyone hit, all the high points that I think that we want to get into today and talk a little bit about what our plan is for going forward. But before I jump into that, thank you, Councillor. My name is Justin Sterrett. I'm the CFO for the city. Nick Arnello, who is the Commissioner of Assessing, who works on valuing properties in the city, including those of our nonprofit institutions. And then Casey Brock-Wilson, Director of Strategic Partnerships in my office, who oversees the Community Benefits Program and the reporting, and working very closely with our very valued institutions. I think I want to start my very brief presentation today with that exact moment. They are indispensable members of our community when we talk about our institutions, right? So whether they are a world-class hospital, a top-ranked university, a first-in-class art institution that we have in the city, those are what make up the fabric of our city at the end of the day and make it such a attractive and livable and vibrant place to be. So without them, we are really not Boston. And we have to start with a thank you for them and really be grateful for their presence in our city as they continue to attract visitors, attract investment, and attract different sorts of growth that we see, not necessarily on the property tax side, but we certainly see making our city a more vibrant and attractive place for investment and for people to come and live and work. So we want to start right there. And I also want to start with the pilot program itself. The pilot program, is a voluntary program created decades ago that was reformed about a decade ago under an initial task force to really sort of recognize that, yes, while these institutions are valued members of our community that are bringing people to the city, that are attracting investment, they do create an additional cost that is incurred by the city, whether it's in expenses that we're incurring or schools or all the different types of expenses that we have as a city. So there really was a citywide approach to how do we bring together institutions, the community, the city council, the administration, to have a conversation about pilot and have a conversation about how we can create a more formalized structure than existed prior to, which, if folks remember, was really a hodgepodge of different types of agreements with the institutions themselves. So a decade ago, reforming the program and creating the program. And we have been fortunate that, since that time, the program has only gotten stronger, whether it comes to the community benefits portion or the financial commitment that we have from our partners that represents about $30 million a year into the city budget. So while it's certainly not the billions that we collect in property taxes, it is a very valuable resource that the city relies on for the operating budget. So we want to make sure that as we think about community benefits, we think about all the work that we're doing on this topic, we want to make sure that that remains a very valued part of our investments that we make every year is through that investment. And there is not a week goes by that either a colleague in another part of the country, whether at my level or with Nick or with Casey, is reaching out to figure out how they can design programs similar to our City of Boston pilot program. But understanding that, obviously we're going to want to take a look at new programs every 10 years, and then we're going to want to find opportunities for reform and to better reflect the community's needs. So the administration under Mayor Janey today is sort of recognizing that this is a conversation that we want to have with the council, have with the community, have with advocates, have with our institutions. So we're going to be announcing today the formation of an inclusive pilot task force composed of those institutional partners, electeds, labor, the community, and certainly the city council led through the chair of this committee to make sure that we have an opportunity to have a very public, a very transparent and accountable conversation about how we want the community benefits to look going forward, because there is a lot of difference of opinion on the community benefits, who they're benefiting, how they're decided. And we want to have a really transparent conversation about what that looks like going forward. So this new committee that we'll be launching this month or later this month will be comprised of all those community members I mentioned, with a focus on looking at the community benefits program. But ultimately, the agenda is going to be up to this task force to determine, thinking about the program from community benefits all the way down to the cash payments and the program writ large. So we're really excited about it. We really are looking forward to bringing the community together to talk about it. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Nick and Casey, who will walk through a little bit more on the program and talk a little bit more about the task force that we're announcing today. Nick?
Thank you, Justin. Thank you to councilors for having us here as well. I think Justin just gave a great overview of kind of how our approach is. I think I just want to reiterate that the current program is clearly an outstanding success and has been a clear success and a nation-leading program. And so this task force that we're talking about is not about reinventing the wheel. It's not about fixing something that's not broken. What it's about is kind of looking back at what's happened over the past 10 years, seeing where the program has succeeded and keeping those elements, but then looking at where it can be better, where it can be stronger. And so we really want to kind of get all perspectives on that. And so the way that we think is the best way forward is to create this kind of task force where we're bringing in city councilors, administration, the institutions, members of the public to have a conversation about kind of what the relationship should be between the city and institutions going forward, specifically with the focus on the community benefit portion of the program as it currently exists. And we think it's really important to have all those voices and to have everyone feel kind of connected, and to build a little bit on something that Justin mentioned. You know, the institutions in the city, I think, have really done an excellent job in the past of growing together, and that they add an enormous amount of value to the city and the city adds an enormous amount of value to them. And it really is this symbiotic relationship that I think everyone wants to continue, and everyone can kind of build and grow and succeed together. And so the new task force is really about continuing that relationship and figuring out how to make things even stronger and better than they are currently. So thank you again, everyone, for having me. And I will give Casey Brock Wilson, our Director of Strategic Partnerships, as you so perfectly put it, Councillor Bach, an opportunity to go into a little more detail on community benefits as they currently exist.
Thanks, Nick and Justin. And thank you to the chair for hosting this space to talk about the pilot program. My name is Casey Brock Wilson, and I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Administration and Finance. And thank you to all the institutions, advocates, and community members who are on the Zoom today as well. We look forward to listening to each panel today, as well as the public testimony and learning from each and every one of you. I'm briefly going to talk today about the history of the pilot community benefits program, what we've learned in the past few years of work, and then spend some time talking about the path ahead that Justin previewed at the beginning. From the beginning, I think one unique feature of the pilot program has been the opportunity for every institution to offset a portion of the requested cash payment with proof of community benefits. That amount has always been capped at 50% to balance the city's need for revenue and the value of the institution's community benefits. And in the initial report, if you go back to it in 2010, the task force really recognized that it is and was inherently difficult to value the worth of an organization's contributions to the city. And, you know, pilot is one piece of that, but we know that there are many other ways that the institution interacts with the city. This challenge we know only grows when we start applying one program to lots of different types of institutions, from hospitals to universities to cultural organizations. But the task force did its best to capture some broad guidelines for community benefits, which still stand today. Those guidelines, just as a reminder for folks, are: one, to directly benefit the city of Boston and its residents; 2 is to support the city's mission and priorities with the idea that the city would support such an initiative in its budget if the institution could not provide it. 3 is to emphasize the ways in which an institution and the city can collaborate to address shared goals. 4th is that the services must be quantifiable. And 5th is that the city on its side must be consistent and transparent in its approach so that institutions can plan accordingly in their own budgeting processes. Some examples that the task force specifically called out were academic scholarships, job training initiatives, health disparity programs, among many others. And I encourage everybody to look back at that initial report. And finally, the pilot community benefits, again, are just one piece of the way an organization interacts with the city. But should only include investments that are above and beyond commitments in institutional master plans, Article 80 requirements, determination of need, and the like. So really one piece of the overall way that institutions interact with the city. As I mentioned, this framework from the task force has been what we've largely operated with for the past 10 years. Every year, institutions look back at their work and report on those community benefits that meet that framework to the city in what's called a community benefits report. If the community benefits reported are in line with the framework established by that task force in 2010, they are eligible to receive up to 50% credit for those community benefits off the requested cash payment, as discussed earlier. And for many years, I would say the community benefits program was kind of the sleepy part of the pilot program. It didn't receive the attention it deserved. And so beginning in 2017, our team here worked in partnership with the pilot institutions to increase our understanding of pilot community benefits by 1, encouraging more participation from our institutional partners, and 2, taking a closer look at the reports themselves so that we could begin to estimate collective impact. So, for example, in FY16, there were only 23 institutions that submitted, or there were 23 institutions that did not submit any type of community benefit program. And in partnership with institutions, we worked really hard to reduce that number of people who are not submitting community benefit reports. In FY20, we were able to reduce it down to 10 institutions. That gives us a much better basis of information about the program to understand collective impact, like I talked about earlier. All of those reports are posted on our website in full at boston.gov/pilot, as well as a summary report in each year from 2018 to 2020. If you haven't had a chance to look at them, I encourage you to download them. In FY20, our most recent full year, 37 institutions submitted community benefits reports totaling $153 million, which is approximately 3 times the amount of credit that those institutions were eligible to receive. As a result, they received 52.9 in community benefits credit. By our estimates, the institutions partnered with over 530 local nonprofit organizations to implement these programs in FY20. As part of our effort to better understand community benefits as a part of pilot, we also have asked our institutional partners to share 2 new pieces of information. One, which is what community benefit category did each program fall under, from housing to education to community health to violence prevention, and what neighborhoods did they impact. Those 2 pieces of information are just the beginning of starting to understand this program even more fully. And through that work, we know that, for example, in FY20, our institutions supported over $53 million in scholarships and grants specific to Boston residents, about $4 million in employment, workforce training, and summer jobs programs, $4 million in community safety, youth empowerment, trauma support, $28 million in preventative care, $6 million in free or discounted admission to our cultural institutions. And I could keep going. Right? I'm not going to run through the entire summary report. You can find it on our website. And geographically, we found that about 70% of the programs reported serve residents citywide. And then we have a breakdown by neighborhood as well in the report. So I think I'll turn now to kind of what's ahead, which is why we're all here today. As Nick and Justin mentioned, right, this is a nation-leading program that is really important to the city for a variety of different reasons. But still, every nation-leading program has room for improvement, and that's why we're here today. 10 years after the initial task force published its report, we think now is a good time to look back on what's worked and how we can improve upon this solid foundation with renewed purpose and a shared sense of responsibility for the future. So to do so, we'll be forming the pilot task force that Justin mentioned earlier, composed of institutional partners, electeds, advocates, labor, and community members. We anticipate that the chair of the committee will be an important member of the task force, along with many other stakeholders. Its initial charge, as Justin mentioned, will be to modernize the community benefits program. But ultimately, the agenda will be determined in partnership with the task force. That was one of the strengths of the initial task force, is together they worked on the initial charge to really build out the agenda. And we think we can do the same here. Together, the goal is to revisit the initial framework that I shared earlier about community benefits and how we can proactively address the common needs of Boston residents, better incorporate community voice, and strengthen the partnership between the city and its institutions. We know that the challenges and opportunities that Boston faces require collective effort across public and private institutions, and this is one way we can continue to do that. And as many have mentioned at the beginning of this hearing today, there's no better example of that than the past year. During the pandemic, the intentional collaboration, cross-sector cooperation, and joint investment has helped our city respond and recover more effectively and efficiently, and we hope we can continue that momentum going forward. 2021 really, in so many ways, represents an opportunity for Boston to learn from the past year, along with a decade of shared experience on the pilot program, and to improve the program so that we can better tackle the deep inequities that exist in Boston and that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. We think that Boston will continue to be a national model for a partnership between a city, its institutions, and its residents, and we look forward to working with all of you on that. This is just the beginning of the conversation. 10 years after the first pilot task force, we invite our institutional partners, labor, advocates, community members, many of you on this call today, to join us in this effort, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Casey and Justin and Nick. Counselors, I'm just sending everybody the order. I guess I'll just start with, I think that the community, like exactly that coordination, like we were talking about, right, is a place for real growth. And I also think, I've been pretty aware in my district of the determination of needs process that the hospitals have and how that has evolved in a way that's like a bit more targeted and coordinated. So I guess I wondered, I think obviously we need stakeholders around the table for this, and we're trying to have all those voices here at the hearing today. But I wondered, Casey, if you could speak a little bit more from your perspective, like as having managed this community benefits program, like, what feel like the leading edges there on places that we could go, recognizing that you guys are proposing a kind of stakeholder conversation.
It's a good question. And ultimately, I think, like you recognize, like this will be the work of the task force. So I don't want to predetermine it too much, but we've certainly heard feedback and ideas over the years from both institutions, advocates, and others that we, expect to be a part of the conversation with the task force. So for example, we know that our system for community benefits reports, which are Excel spreadsheets, is pretty outdated. And doesn't allow room for institutions to tell any of the story of their work, and doesn't make it easy for interested community members to digest or understand the impact of these programs. So, that's something we've heard loud and clear over the years. That is one, easy thing that we can start on together. I think we've also seen the work of the Attorney General's office with their own voluntary statewide community benefits program change over the years. That is, specific to the healthcare institutions, But there are certainly things that we can learn from them about community engagement, social determinants of health. And, it's not, again, not an exact corollary to our Boston specific program that is cross-institutional, but I think there are certainly things that we could learn from their process that we could incorporate into this. So those are a couple examples that come to mind, but there's many more that I expect to be topics of conversation where we're inviting experts and others who have interacted with the program or are experts in this space to really help inform the conversation with the task force as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I guess for me, the things that feel important, they're that coordination, like I talked about, the idea of like really targeting the big challenges of the city, really thinking about the things that we would spend taxpayer dollars on if we weren't figuring out how to do them institutionally. And then more of a co-governance model. I know one of the things that I've consistently heard from folks is just the, everybody wanting to be at that table, not kind of have a committee at some institution sort of deciding what might be wanted for the people of Boston, and the community benefits that people are more excited about tend to be the ones that have been figured out that way. But I'm going to try to model not going on for the full 5 minutes, just because we've got the pilot action group is going to do a panel after the administration, and then we've also got the institutions. So I'll go to my colleagues just for questions and ask everybody to be mindful of that time. Next up, Councillor Braden.
Thank you. I'm pleased to hear that we're setting up this this task force to investigate and develop and improve our community benefits process. And just in terms, I know it's just been announced today, but in terms of who will be the task force, how will it be made up? And the other question was really in terms of our community benefits submissions over the past 10 years, have we ever seen a community benefits submission and had it be rejected by the city as inadequate or lacking in some way? I'm just curious, is it just a matter of putting in the report and then that's it, or do you ever give feedback to the institution about where they may be falling short or whether they're doing some great job?
So I'll take the first one, Councillor, and then I'll let Casey take the report question. So I think as we said earlier, we're just starting the process, I think, of starting this task force. So we're going to invite all of the longtime partners and all of the longtime folks who are sort of invested in this work, and we're going to be sort of sharing the full list in the weeks ahead. But it'll certainly have council representation on it, sort of community and advocate representation, and then certainly the valued institutions who are sort of providing the resources will be key members of it, because that's really what made the first task force a success 10 years ago, because it had really buy-in from all the different players. So we definitely look forward to including that same type of group going forward. Casey, do you want to answer the question about the reporting?
Sure. So Councillor Braden, my team reads all the reports that come in across all the institutions and has the fun task of going through all of them. As what we've seen for the FY20 year, as I mentioned, there were some institutions who did not submit at all. And then for the ones that did submit, we did go through the process of kind of going through the framework on them. I believe, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it was around 17 or 18 programs that were not eligible last year for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes they were covered in an institutional IMP agreement, like we talked about earlier, which is a separate program. In other cases, they were something that we did not believe was a community benefit as defined by the initial task force. Certainly something that was important to Boston, but not something that was outlined under the initial framework. So for example, salaries paid to Boston residents or spend by students at Boston restaurants. Again, incredibly important to our economy, incredibly important to the city of Boston, but it is not a part of the community benefits as outlined in the task force.
Thank you. I'm going to pass and I'll hold the rest of my questions for later. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Braden. Going next to Councillor Arroyo, then Councillor Campbell, and I just want to note we are also joined by my colleague, Councillor Julia Mejia at large. Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try and make this short because my connection isn't great. But in terms of what I've heard outlined in terms of community benefits, it's obvious that some of these institutions do offer real community benefits, and then in some cases they label other things as community benefits that I think would be debatable or disputable. But in terms of doing a study as to the true cost of these institutions to the city of Boston, have we ever done anything like that? And to just kind of make clear what I'm asking, when I was in Chicago for law school, they were trying to model our pilot program. And what they realized after they had done a study of the institutions is what they were asking for from the institutions financially through pilot wasn't actually even breaking even with the resources that the city spent, like trash pickup or policing or healthcare or any of the in terms of EMS, the kinds of things that they were costing the city from a use standpoint that they weren't paying taxes into. And so have we ever done a similar study here for our Boston institutions?
So I'll let Nick, thank you for the questions, Councilor. Very apropos for this conversation. So I'll let Nick jump in on the details of what the task force in 2010 looked like. But generally speaking, yes, as part of the original task force recommendations, we did look, the city did look at sort of what were, costs that were incurred because of increased 911 calls or, increased trash pickup. Most of those institutions have their own police or fire units, and most of those institutions have their own trash pickup. So some of the costs that a typical resident may be, getting from the city are sort of, there is no benefit for the institution. But Nick, why don't you maybe have some specifics on what exactly we looked at before?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that a little bit. So to answer your question, Councilor Arroyo, the original framework and the framework that the city has been operating off of for quite some time is a 25% concept. And the 25% figure is establishing a request based on 25% of institutions' assessed property value. And that was established, it was actually a figure established long before the task force, and it's been vetted a few times over the past few decades. But it's to identify the portion of the city's budget that is spent on these kind of common use services, things like fire, police, street cleanup, snow removal, these aspects that really benefit every property in the city. And so a few times that has been looked at over the decades, that's come out to be about 25% of the revenue that is generated by property taxes in terms of a portion of the city's budget. And so that figure is the current basis for the requests to institutions now in terms of the voluntary payments that we look for every year. And that 25% figure is then what institutions can get a credit towards in their community benefit submissions. So we look for, overall, the program is seeking a large amount of cash contributions, and then the current program provides an opportunity to get a credit towards that cash request. And so that's what we're talking about, community benefits and credits and 50% caps. That's all in a credit towards our overall program.
Thank you. I appreciate that sort of in-depth question. And then I guess the question is, moving forward, is this part of what the task force is going to be figuring out, or is there a plan in place to make sure that we're sort of updating? Because obviously the property tax payments that we're making, those haven't been updated in quite some time in terms of what their property land tax assessments were. But is there a sort of plan in motion? Is there anything that's being currently done or anything that's related to this task force that's going to sort of regularize or create a regular schedule? I don't know if I just invented that word, but create a regular schedule for these sorts of updates to the property tax and or the assessments of sort of what the cost is and arrange or affect that percentage that we ask for.
Yeah, Council. Nick, do you want to give an update on where we are with evaluations?
Sure. So I think we we made an announcement last year that the assessment department is revisiting the values of the charitable property around the city. And that's a process that we are working on this calendar year. We have that lined up with our regular valuation process for all of real estate. So right now we're kind of in a data collection phase, and then we're going to be developing valuation standards, and we're going to be looking for value approvals in the fall and into the early winter. So by the end of the calendar year, we should have updated values not only for taxable property, but also for our exempt institutions. And then that information will be available for the task force to look at and review in terms of what it's considering. You know, the initial charge of the task force is definitely going to be focused on community benefits, but we want to make sure that it has the opportunity, if it makes sense, to move that into a conversation about the program as a whole, which would potentially get into things that you're talking about, Councilor Arroyo, in terms of what percentage makes sense, what the overall request might be that makes sense, but the initial focus is definitely on community benefits.
Thank you so much. That's it for me now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Edwards, and then it'll be Councilor Mejia.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent, thank you. So I appreciate the task force. I remember talking about it in some hearings ago about how we wanted to make sure community was more informative of defining what is community benefits. So I thank you. This is good leadership. I'm excited about this conversation. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about it in terms of, will the task force have goals set this year or results?
Goals for, sorry, can you just restate the question?
So you have a task force set up for all the universities to come together to discuss, at least right now, defining community benefits, right? Right?
Yep.
Will that definition come this year?
So I think the task force itself will meet this year to make decisions for FY23, right? So we're about to go into FY21 in 2.5 weeks. The goal would be to have a process over the next 6 to 8 months so that we can get it ready, as Nick mentioned, for the FY23 budget process, which obviously we'll be going through next spring.
Okay, so you expect to have recommendations in the next 6 to 8 months for next year?
Yep, at least on the community benefits piece. And I think that the longer term questions around the program will sort of be dependent on where the task force wants to take it.
Who's on the task force?
So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to invite the same partners that we've had in the past, and I think that we'll be finalizing that list in the coming weeks.
So the universities?
Yep, it'll certainly have representatives from all the institutions, universities, hospitals, arts and culture, certainly, who are definitely an important piece of this, who we don't want to lose. The council, obviously advocates in the community will be invited. And then the administration and the city will be providing the staff and support as needed.
Great. I guess I want to make sure that this is I would love some more clarity on how the community is going to inform the goals of this task force. Right now, it seems like we're going to have a meeting, like everyone's involved. It's a stakeholder, and in 6 to 8 months, somehow, somewhere, we're going to get to some sort of goals that maybe get to a goal or get to some defined goals. I would love maybe some in a follow-up hearing or in a follow-up announcement, like who on the council, is all the council members have a seat on this task force? Is that what you're saying? Are there seats on this task force? Are there votes on this task force? What is this?
You mean council by you mean city council?
That's the only council I'm thinking of, not lawyer council. Yes, I'm thinking of the.
So we will be inviting the chair of the committee to sit on it as the representative of the council, given the obviously the role she plays now with the new committee. I think we're going to defer to the council to decide sort of what the structure is. I don't think it'll be a formal voting structure where people are sort of appointed. The goal will be, though, to get everyone involved, because that's the way you make the community benefits portion, I think, work for everyone, is that you have to bring the institutions, you have to bring the community, and you have to bring sort of the administration and the city, including the city council, to make sure that we provide the oversight of that process. So I think it will be a little bit of a evolving process about what the final form looks like and what the final product looks like, but it is something that we want to be very transparent and accountable, so we get buy-in for everybody.
Does
The only thing
administration- Go ahead.
The only thing I'll add is I think we expect this to be a really working task force, right? As we've scoped it out, we're talking about, we're still in initial phases of it. I think we're talking about, right, monthly meetings. Like, we know there's a lot of work to do on this to push the agenda forward. And so, we want the task force to really be a working task force so we can get to a set of recommendations to help us move forward together.
And I appreciate that. I think the structure right now seems so loose, and since everyone's kind of invited, but no one has a final decision or there's no vote to push any other way, if community and institutions are all just sitting in a room, I don't know that consensus, there seems to be no structure to set up to get to consensus or to get to a final decision in 6 to 8 months. There's really not even a deadline to get to a final decision on.
Well, the deadline will be fiscal year 23, right? So that'll be, a 6 to 8 months, hopefully, that we get a recommendation for the, spring, winter of 2022. I would say that the task force in 2010, this is modeled similar to that, right? So they were able to come to consensus because everyone had a seat at the table.
Right. And well, I'm confused. I wasn't sure how many community members actually felt that they had a seat at that table, but there was money discussed, right? And they came up with the current procedures, right?
Yep.
That they paid attention to for 1 year and then have promptly somewhat ignored, kind of followed through for some time. So certainly one thing I'd love to make sure that this task force does is come up with an enforcement mechanism or some sort of way, even if you're kicked off the task force if you don't pay or something. But this is modeled off 2010. I understand we're leading the nation, but if everyone else is so poor at it, that leadership shouldn't be so lauded. It shouldn't be treated as like the goal and end goal. I mean, we'll go back and forth about how we're measuring our leadership, right? And we use, I think, a different year. We should be using modern assessment of taxes and property. It would actually probably show a bigger gap in what they're supposed to be paying. So those are all things I hope that are on the table. I have the ordinance that we also are going to be pushing for this year to solidify certain things. I think actually in the ordinance, it may have mentioned something about a task force or some sort of, assessment of community benefits. So great, kudos that we're already having that conversation. But, the reason why we push for ordinances and push for firm goals is because of my biggest concern that the task force of 2010 got us a big lump push and then it's dwindled out. And we've never really assessed how to bring them back to the table in a real way that's going to make them consistent and pay according to 2021, 2022, 2023 assessed values.
So I think I can speak about this for a minute. So respectfully, I think from 2010 to the present, there has been an enormous amount of evolution in the program and an enormous amount of growth. And I think you can see that if you just look back at the historical numbers and kind of how they've progressed every year. I think that this is an opportunity to revisit the existing program and look for those areas that can be better. But this is not something where the administration feels like it should be dictating. We're dealing about a voluntary program. We're talking about a program where the whole reason that I see it to have a task force in this instance is not to dictate those results. It's not to tell the task force, this is what you're going to do. It's to bring people together to see what we have and to kind of have an open dialogue about what can be better and what can't be. So it's a little challenging to kind of answer your questions in terms of like, well, when is the process going to be done? What's the end result going to be? Because it's not something that we're dictating.
I'll just to push back on that, say we community has been coming together, the pilot task force, which I'm sure you'll hear from, and several hearings from city council to talk about this continually about where the gaps are and so on and so forth. And the biggest concern, right, is that for me right now is to announce and to do a task force that is essentially it seems to have no seems to have no clear defined what we're going to do, get out of it and move on and how we're going to get there. It's a concern. There's just one more kind of community conversation that we feel good about having, but doesn't actually result in anything. That's my concern. And so when I'm asking these questions, you announced the task force, you guys came up with it. So what's the deadline to get things done who's going to be on it, and how you make decisions. I don't think these are difficult conversations or difficult questions. I don't think they're getting the cart before the horse. I think these are things that you should have answers to. That's all.
Yeah, and Counselor, I think that what we're trying to get at is, we're talking about a voluntary program, so we need the buy-in from all the partners at the table. So we can't dictate to them right at this moment what the outcomes are going to be or sort of what the final deadlines are going to be. I think we have a good set of sort of timeline of when we want to take place. It coincides with the revalue that we're doing right now. It coincides with getting ready for the FY23 budget. We wouldn't want to sort of restart the program right in the middle of budget season. So I think we have a timeline that's going to work, and it's going to be up to the partners from all sides of the conversation to come together around a solution, because that's what happened before. And I think we just want to focus this force part, maybe because we missed it in 2010, around the community benefits piece. So that's why I think we're focusing on that to start with, so we can get that community-driven conversation and that community advocacy that I know folks at the council level, at the advocacy level, have been having for years. We want to bring that to a more formal process with the administration, with the institutions, and with everyone at the table to get to a better solution.
Great. And I just putting it on this then for the task force, or for the chairwoman who's going to be sitting on the task force. I hope one of the deliverables as soon as possible is a community-led list of only acceptable forms of community benefits, such that it is informed by the people and the community that are impacted negatively by the institution and the institutional creep that is happening in many of the neighborhoods. I would hope that then the community benefits list is driven by them, and that it's a firm list of, like, I would also look again to the chair when dealing with developers, coming up with a list of acceptable mitigation for the new zoning amendment. I'd like to see something like that that's informed by the community. Pick one of these, pick 3 of these, pick something of these for you to qualify and meet your community benefit agreement obligations. That's what I think actually is going to help really inform, but also not allow for the silliness which has happened from some institutional partners of saying, for example, that because their students, their private high school, that by virtue of having those students go to high school there, that was their community benefits, right? I think we've seen enough of what happens when the institutions inform or water down what is community and what's an actual benefit. And I don't want to accept that ever again. So the task force should be, for the definition, should come up with a finite list of things driven by the community that institutions can either meet the standard for or fail.
I think we look forward to having that conversation with the task force. And I will just note that community benefit that you specifically mentioned was not accepted as a community benefit for that reason. So we hear you on that, and it's something that we're mindful of.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Councillor Mejia?
Yeah, so I just kind of want to echo some of the same sentiments that Councillor Edwards just brought up in terms of the accountability piece. More specifically for me is who is at the table and how we're defining these seats. And I would advocate that we are leading with community, and while I do appreciate having the institutions at the table because they're definitely key stakeholders, but oftentimes those who are really living the realities are not as present or as vocal. So I think overwhelmingly, I'd love to see more community members. And I also think it would be great for us to have folks from the housing space involved in these conversations, because we know that a lot of these, I'm speaking specifically around some of these institutions that are occupying a lot of space. And oftentimes they're literally pricing people out of these neighborhoods. So I'd like to see some representation in the task force that are advocates in the housing space, as well as workforce development. I think when I think about community benefits, I'd love to see our universities leaning in more to workforce. And I also think that in terms of accountability, would love to see metrics, right? Quarterly goals that are being set forth, and that there's a way for us to measure the outcomes, and that there needs to be regular and consistent communication to the public about what this work is looking like, and that the community aside from that, that we have the task force, but that there is a level of high engagement with the community, and whether that is convening people and sharing out, here's where we're at, here's what we're doing, here's some of the hiccups that we have come across. Like, I think that level of engagement, it can't just be another task force for the sake of having a task force. And there is no real process in place for community accountability. And I'm just curious about what thought you've given to that level of accountability for feedback.
I love the idea of metrics, Counselor. I think it's a great, I want to do two things. One, I want to take down the notes you had about bringing housing advocates and housing members to the forefront of the community-based conversation. And I think that we'll certainly take that back. And then two, on the metric side, I think that would be a perfect opportunity for the council, the task force, both the institutions and the community to sort of come together on what are the metrics that we want to keep track of and what are the sort of benefits that we want to be tracking on a quarterly basis or yearly basis. Because you're right now it is mostly just, did you submit your community benefits report? How much credit are you getting? And then what was your cash contribution? So adding more metrics, I think, could certainly be sort of within the purview, and then using that to hold everyone accountable, I think is a great idea.
Yeah, and then I'd like to, if the task force, what does when we talk about accountability, what are we going to do for those players that are not keeping up to par with those benefits, right? These folks who are always in constant violation, right? At what point are we going to actually really, I guess, I wouldn't say punish them, but like something has to give, right? We need to have some very specific language that people understand that we're not here to play games anymore, right? And I think that we've given a lot of people a pass for far too long. And at some point, the task force, it would be helpful if the task force can make the recommendations of what happens when you're in violation of not paying your fair share. And I think that we as a city need to be accountable to that, Justin. And I think that the task force is well positioned to clearly define what that penalty is.
Thanks, Councilor. Yeah, no, it's a tough, and I actually think to something Councilor Edwards said about holding them accountable if their community benefits doesn't pass the test of the task force. I think that's our really only stick in this situation. It's a voluntary program at the end of the day. I think that's why we so value the institutions being a part of the task force, because they'll be able to both hold themselves accountable, but also hold their compatriots and their colleagues accountable for holding up both their end of the community benefit portion, but also the cash portion. So I think metrics around those lines. I think looking at what types of things qualify for community benefits would certainly be the not the lowest hanging fruit, but certainly some of the areas that I think that the task force can address and can consider. But again, we don't want to dictate, before the task force has had a chance to meet.
Right, and so I know before I see that gavel, I'm sure Councilor Bach has it ready to go, is that when we think about the usual suspects of folks who we've had the most problems with, they should be at the table, and they should be willing and ready and eager and enthusiastic that they've been invited to the table, and they should not get a pass. And they should come ready to be a partner and do whatever it takes to, satisfy the needs of the community, this is supposed to be the benefit of the community. And while I appreciate it being voluntary, at the end of the day, they have a responsibility to show up in ways that make it seem like they deeply do care about the people that live in the city of Boston.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. Yeah, definitely agree. I think, so as folks know, we're just about to be at 4 o'clock, and we do have the Pilot Action Group keyed up to talk to us on the next panel about sort of community benefits. And obviously the Pilot Action Group have been many advocates on this issue. And in fact, have also been advocates for a task force on pilot. So so excited to hear from them. And then we're going to also go to a panel of the institutions. So I guess I would ask council colleagues, I'd like to move to the next panel. If anybody has An absolutely urgent question for the administration before I move on. If you can raise your blue hand or otherwise signal. Councilor Mejia? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that the administration is staying. I'm asking whether or not the administration is going to stay on for when the advocates are speaking too, just because I feel like oftentimes there's some really good, rich dialogue that happens when they're in the space. So just a question. I may be out of line.
We will all be listening, Counselor.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so then without further ado, I want to go over, we're being joined for this panel. Well, first I should thank Chief Sterrett and Casey and Nick for joining us. And then going now on this panel, we'll hear from Enid Eckstein, who's the coordinator of the Pilot Action Group, Cassie Infante from the, who's the Black Mass Coalition Manager from BECMA, Nia Evans, the Executive Director of the Boston Ujima Project, Cortina Van, Community Organizer at MAHA, and Anthony Desidora, the President of the Civic Association out in Alston, I think. But Anthony, you can correct me, sorry. So Enid, to you first. Enid, you're muted.
Yes, typical Zoom, you're muted. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. So my name is Enid Eckstein, and the Pilot Action Group, for people who do not know, is a coalition of labor, community, faith-based organizations fighting to build a stronger pilot program. We want to thank Councilor Brock, Councilor Breeden, and the City Council and others for holding this hearing. So we've all along, we've called for increasing pilot collections, revaluation of the properties, greater definition and investment of community benefits. And we're glad to hear that the city has actually already engaged in starting the revaluation. And we're pleased to hear today about the creation of a task force. Since we've advocated for one, I think we'll follow up with some recommendations to the council on what we think the composition would be. But I would say that listening just now, definitely concerned about a couple of issues. Composition. We want to make sure this is led by community voices, since we're talking about community and community benefits. We obviously want to ensure the Pilot Action Group, which I think has pushed and been the annoying relatives who sometimes get invited, that we have a seat at the table. And we want to make sure that there's increasing oversight and accountability and clear goals for the for the committee. We know that there are some really positive things about the pilot program, but we believe that we need to bring it up to 2021 and also beyond. So today, what I want to do is really highlight some of our recommendations and as we move forward. Also, we provided a pretty lengthy memo to the City Council. So I'm not going to repeat everything. I just want to highlight some real key recommendations. First of all, yes, the institutions play an important role in our city, but let's be clear. They're not going anywhere, and we need to engage in a real dialogue with them about what the future of our city looks like. So I would say there's a number of things. One is we need to align community benefit spending with current needs of the city. We can look and we should ask, what are our priorities as a city? The recent community health needs assessment that the hospitals did, I think, provides a good map for the city. Yes, it was hospitals, but I don't believe there's a distinction between one end of Mission Hill that the Brigham sits on and the other end of Mission Hill where Northeastern sits. Same problems, displacement, gentrification, food insecurity, et cetera. So we know that there's a metric within healthcare. It's called the social determinants of health. Very clear. And we believe that's what the city should be encouraging its institutions to invest in. But we find that much of the current investment in community benefits is not in that area. So we need to ask, we need to set certain criteria for what community investment is, and we need to ensure that institutions have a good strategy and understand which social determinants of health they should be in. We need to create a written standard definition of community benefits. At our hearing several years ago, several institutions asked about community benefits, and they were told, well, there wasn't a current standard. I sat on the Attorney General's task force when the Attorney General did the looking at community benefits, and we created a standard framework for looking at community benefits. We believe that's a good starting point for the city. We need to ensure there's also strategic investment of benefits. And what I mean by that is in the last 10 years, there's approximately 380 million that has been forgiven in community benefits. Imagine if there had been forethought about where we could collectively invest those benefits. And we had picked a few projects that could have been a game changer for the city and really a true model for pilot. We need to create transparency and bring decision-making into the public sphere. Pilot funds are offset by the city as part of the pilot process. These are not decisions that should be made between City Hall and the institutions. We believe these decisions need to be made publicly in a participatory process that highlights the needs of marginalized communities, especially the needs of the surrounding community, whether it's the Northeastern community, the Austin Brighton community, et cetera. We need to create true community engagement in decision-making. I would say that the institutions may tell you they have committees and they make decisions. In many cases, these are window dressing. Members are picked by the institutions, and often decisions get rubber stamped by the committee. The Attorney General has a process, the Department of Public Health have a process. Those are starting points. And I have two more recommendations. There should be a standardized annual report that really breaks out the community benefits, requests, and cash, and creates a ranking about whether institutions are actually publicly meeting their requests for investment in social determinants. And lastly, I think an important one is that we need a new social contract in our city. We all have been through a very difficult year. Our city faces a crisis of inequity, structural racism, et cetera. We cannot afford to be just a city of the wealthy. Our institutions are an important fabric of the city. We understand that smaller institutions may be challenged, but let us be clear, we have some of the richest institutions in the world sitting in Boston. These are institutions that have large endowments and reserves. Harvard has an endowment of over $41 billion, spent over $100 million in the last few years to buy vineyards in California, to invest in Amazon deforestation, bought shares in Uber. Many of the institutions saw their endowments grow at a good clip last year. MGH Brigham System sits on almost $4 billion in assets just for their Boston hospitals. So my question is, how about investing in low-cost housing? Or how about Madison Park High School? Or any of a number of projects that are really critical programs to the future of our city. This is a year when we need to think outside the box. We need to create a true pilot program when we work together to address the city's needs. We welcome the mayor and the city's announcement of starting a committee. We believe the work should begin, but we also believe that we should have a vision for what pilot should be, which is a true pilot agreement to really look at how do we address social inequity in our city, and how do we use the moment we're in to really look at a true recovery that asks the institutions to come to the table and be creative and really address changes in this pilot program. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Enid. And next up, we've got Cassie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Counselor. And thank you, Enid, for that brilliant introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cassie Infante, and I am the manager for the Black Mass Coalition, or BMC for short. BMC is a network of organizations that includes members like the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, BECMA, King Boston, the Boston Ujima Project, and the North American Indian Center of Boston. And our coalition was formed in June 2020 as a response to the racial reckoning following the death of George Floyd, in which we produced a blueprint that identifies tangible actions that address racial injustice across sectors such as private, anchor institutions, and government. And so our work and mission is radically simple but urgent. We believe that in order to uplift BIPOC communities, we must transform the city and our Commonwealth economically across sectors and shift the balances of power to those who for too long have not been included. And I'm here today on behalf of our coalition in full support of the Pilot Action Group. It's imperative that we create an oversight body that holds these institutions accountable for full participation, while also providing authentic, transparent community engagement on what constitutes a community benefit. We need to ensure that decisions made for community benefit investment are made in an open process that lifts up community voices and reflects the needs of the community. Additionally, as Boston continues to emerge from the pandemic, it's really an opportunity for us to reevaluate the role of these major anchor institutions. Hospitals and universities, as Enid mentioned, have access to significant financial resources and political influence. It is only right and just that they reinvest in our communities what we pour into their bottom line. Many of these institutions covered by pilot have increased their square footage and land use within the city. And while these institutions and the economy are doing relatively well, Boston continues to struggle with great racial wealth inequality. With one study that I know many of you are familiar with, The Color of Wealth, published in 2015, found that the median net worth of the Black household is $8 compared to $247,000 for the median white household. And this wealth gap is a major cause for issues like the lack of homeownership and access to capital to start a new venture, all of which continue to debilitate upward mobility for communities of color. And so these realities really drive organizations such as BECMA and our coalition to affirm that we cannot return to a normal that didn't work for us. And we must create a new normal that uplifts Black businesses and communities, and that closing the racial wealth gap must be an urgent priority for us. And so listed within our coalition's blueprint for a new world are institutional targets for nonprofits, including the fact that institutions must commit to 100% participation in the pilot program across the Commonwealth. That means full cash participation and a redrawing of the standards of community benefits to ensure that funding is reaching the most immediate community need. And the current pilot statistics made available by the City of Boston show that these targets that institutions are falling short of these targets in many ways. Over the last 5 years, institutions were forgiven some $380.8 million in community benefit offset. We believe this is unacceptable. We are shortchanging our own communities by millions of dollars in opportunities for growth. Such opportunities for community investment can include appropriating funds to support alternative economic institutions, grassroots organizations, BIPOC-owned small nonprofits, and business development initiatives, as well as land repatriation, and again, supporting BIPOC businesses. So in closing here, we're really here to urge the council to provide, again, for that community engagement oversight and alignment of the pilot program. Our coalition, the Black Mass Coalition, looks forward to continuing the conversation and mobilizing our network of organizations, community members, and more to really help provide guidance and accountability for this important initiative. I believe our communities are really relying on all of us to work together collectively. And that's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much. Next up, we've got Nia.
Nia Evans, Boston Ujima Project. 3 years ago, as part of our strong support of the recommendations outlined in a pilot report by Enid Eckstein and Jonathan Rodriguez, we highlighted the call to create a community engagement process to oversee and guide the pilot program. We applaud the positive steps the city has taken since 2018, including the creation of the pilot committee, revaluation of the pilot properties, and as of today, the creation of the 2021 task force. In the interest of building upon and making recent positive steps meaningful, we return to the call to create a community engagement process to oversee and guide the pilot program with emphasis on a process that is participatory. 3 years ago, we noted that there is no space for Boston residents themselves to meaningfully understand or influence pilot contributions that are made on residents' behalf. This is still the case. As a reminder, Ujima formed from a drive to respond to Boston's notorious racial health and wealth divide by underwriting our people's strength, directly resourcing what we call our economy builders, our small businesses, our artists, our grassroots organizations. We've created a multi-million-dollar capital fund that is democratically governed and directed by our members and the residents of our communities. We built a participatory process because we believe that democracy is a human right, and because we believe that meaningful community-based planning results in a better, more effective allocation of resources. With our members' first investment vote to invest in Cedro Cooperative, a Black and Latinx worker-owned composting co-op that recently won a campus-wide composting contract at Northeastern University, we've started to make the case for community-engaged participatory processes, belief now becoming knowledge. Asking and listening to residents who are most impacted, centering their intimate and diverse experiences and expertises ensures that problems and solutions, needs and supports actually match. Asking and listening to residents who are most impacted, centering their intimate and diverse experiences and expertise results in actions and initiatives that are forward-looking and innovative. Asking and listening to residents who are most impacted, centering their intimate and diverse experiences and expertise guarantees that institutions' provision of community benefits are actually of valued benefit to communities. 3 years ago, we noted a national wave of participatory budgeting, community-led finance, public banking, catching on as solutions to the crises of economic inequality and unaccountable top-down decision-making. This wave continues to crest as community-engaged participatory processes have recently exhibited the ability to display more relevance and responsiveness than top-down, disconnected, unaccountable processes. Recently, UGMA's participatory process to allocate investments has been noted by Urban Institute, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in partnership with the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance as promising in the direction of restoring community wealth, voice, and accountability. Our communities speak as experts. The solutions we are looking for are here. Our fellow residents hold them, and our city's largest institutions only need to embrace and meaningfully partner with them. Such embrace and partnership is the most direct path to equity and justice for all Boston communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nia. And next up is Cortina. Cortina, lovely to see you.
Nice to see you as well, Counselor. Good afternoon, Boston City Councilors. My name is Cortina Van, and I am a staff member with Massachusetts Affordable Housing Alliance, MAHA, and a concerned homeowner in the community. I want to thank Councilor Kenzie Bach and Councilor Breeden and all the Boston City Councilors for the opportunity to testify this afternoon on the importance of the pilot program in the city of Boston. Now, MAHA is a membership-based organization that's dedicated to increasing public and private investment in affordable, sustainable homeownership. We want to eliminate the racial and economic inequality in the homeownership gap, which seems to be growing more over the years. According to Harvard staff writer Liz Manillo article this recently June entitled Inequality, a series on race and inequality in America, the net wealth of a typical Black family in America is about 1/10 that of a white family. A 2018 analysis of US incomes and wealth written by economists that I have listed in my written testimony concluded that the historical data also revealed that no progress has been made in reducing income and wealth inequalities between Black and white households over the past 70 years. Our affluent and wealthy Boston nonprofits, college, universities, and hospitals utilize essential city resources and services where they need to pay their fair share of payment in lieu of taxes to the city of Boston. The colleges and universities here in Boston and surrounding areas have thousands of students in our neighborhoods, and they must realize that the role they are playing is causing an influx in the housing affordability crisis, which is a direct result in the great social economic disparities happening in our city. For example, looking at the neighborhood of Mission Hill, the percentage of students living there has grown from being majority local city residents to mostly students who may or may not become longtime residents in the area because they too could potentially be priced out of the rental and home ownership market. Don't get me wrong, we love our students and education is important and valued to the highest regard. I believe we can do a better job of making sure we do not exile and undervalue the families and other long life residents who patron and have small business in our communities. They should not have to compete for housing with wealthy Boston nonprofit while they supply these accommodations to students and others that take away from our community. They have caused displacement and gentrification. I am myself, where are the families that, I ask myself, where are these families that once lived in these 2- and 3-family homes in Mission Hill and various sections of Roxbury? I grew up in Roxbury, right behind Roxbury Community College. I see the difference. I was not able to afford to buy my home in the neighborhood I grew up in. According to the Census Bureau, at the end of 2020, the homeownership rate for Black families stood at about 44% compared to 75% for white families. I listened to the struggles of our MAHA members, first-time homebuyer graduates that work at some of our local hospitals and universities and colleges, and they can't afford to buy they can't afford to buy a home in Boston, and some cannot afford to rent here in Boston. These inhabitants work in the various areas of the institutions from like housekeeping, security, administration, food services, nurses, primary care nurses, etc. They are forced to live outside the city of Boston and commute from places like New Bedford, Brockton, Randolph, Attleboro, and other towns located quite a distance from Boston. How does this affect the employees and the institutions? The racial wealth gap is real and getting bigger the longer nothing is being done. As I've shared, at MAHA, we focus on closing the racial homeownership gap. And there is one current initiative I can share with you today that is currently helping other recommended initiatives. You can read about this in our homeownership justice vision, which is on our website at mahahome.org. So the current initiative I wish to talk about is MAHA Stash program, which is basically was started with a small seed grant from Children's Hospital. And so it's a matching fund for first generation home buyers, but I know I'm gonna have an issue with time. So I would ask people to read the testimony and visit our website for more details with this matching funds for first time home buyers. So what we're experiencing in Boston, across the state and across our country is a result of institutional and systematic racism. Racism is a health crisis. Right now, our nonprofit institutions have the opportunity to make a significant investment in housing that could help change the widening wealth gap, which affects everything. Housing affects one's health, the education, mental health, stability, overall one's quality of life. Community benefits should be aligned with the permanent needs of the community. The nonprofit institutions investing in housing could be leveraged with other funds, state, federal, endowment funds, and other incentives. We must have a strategic vision in creating policies, programs that can help with the housing crisis. Programs like Stash, One Plus Boston, et cetera, are just some examples. Currently only the wealthy Boston nonprofits make that lone decision to determine where that 12.5 of the community benefits funds are spent. The current decision-making process model for pilots should be open, transparent, inclusive with community residents, community partners, where there's an open dialogue on what is going on in the community, clear information on the current needs and disparities, and an agreement on what can be done to solve it with community benefit investment. It will take all of us working together to ensure that all have equal access to achieve the American dream and to be valued regardless of race and financial economic disparity. We are all part of the human race and should act like it. I do want to applaud the administration for the announcement of this task force. Obviously, there's some work to be done there. We do look forward to working, we all look forward to working with the Boston City Council and the acting mayor, Kim Janey, to help make any necessary improvements to pilot. I thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Cortina. Anthony?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Anthony Disidoro. I am president of the Alston Civic Association. I want to thank Councilor Bach and my district councilor Braden for sponsoring this hearing in an attempt to take a program in need of reform and to focus its potential as a powerful tool to address systemic inequities in our city. I applaud the efforts of this council in directing the Office of Assessing to finally update the valuations of tax-exempt property, not only because it is the right thing to do, but it will put in stark context the enormous value of the assets and the opportunity before us for better compliance and to apply these resources in a way that allows all Bostonians the freedom to dream big. Those of us who live in communities where institutional expansion is debated frequently have a unique perspective, given we often question the collateral cost benefit derived from educational and medical institutions increasing footprint in our neighborhoods. Some of it driven by the need to better prepare our young people to engage the world before us, much of it to maintain standing at the expense of ever-increasing tuition costs. It must also be stated, Alston Brighton houses approximately 25% of all off-campus students in the city. Another significant source of frustration is how consistent the educational and medical institutions appear to construct virtual walls to shield those who are the decision makers from the community from engaging in talks at setting priorities going forward. Although we have good working relationships with those from government and community relations, the destiny of our community is being determined behind closed doors with little, if any, transparency. Key stakeholders, both public and private, get to sit at the table while those most affected and those who have the most to offer are relegated to a subordinate role. For private educational institutions in our community, in 2019, Harvard University led the country with an endowment valued at $40.58 billion. Boston College endowment was valued at $2.58 billion, and Boston University endowment was valued at $2.30 billion. All three institutions have significant real estate holdings in our community and continue to pursue a robust development agenda. In FY 2020, Harvard University and Boston University improved their pilot contributions to 79% and 87% respectively, and filed community benefit reports. However, Boston College continues to make a mockery of the program by contributing just 23% of their pilot request and chose not to file a community benefits report. Compliance, transparency, and relevance can be achieved when leadership is on display at all levels, and the affected communities have a seat at the table. In Allston-Brighton, affordable housing, including on-campus student housing, public transportation, workforce development, food access, education, climate change, and racial equity can only be advanced if we share a common vision based on fairness and trust. Mutual respect is earned, not granted. I am proud to stand with the Pilot Action Group and their continued advocacy and common sense recommendations to imagine something better. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to the work that lies ahead. And I also want to express my cautious optimism at the news today from the city regarding the creation of the task force. I, like many on this call, support the idea that a task force like this can only work if it is community-driven and it is empowered with an action plan that has realistic goals of implementation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you, Anthony, and to all the panelists. Councillor Braden, you're up first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will keep this very brief. I want to thank everyone who participated in the conversation this afternoon. I think establishing this new task force is a really good step in the right direction. I want to echo the concerns of all the advocates that we need to have a robust community representation in the process. You know, as Tony just mentioned, Allston-Brighton is deeply affected by institutional expansion. When you think about owner occupancy in all our neighborhoods across the city, Mission Hill and Allston have the lowest owner occupancy in the whole city. And it's because the universities don't house most of their students. They have a lot of off-campus housing, and it really drives in speculative investment and outside investors purchasing homes to rent to students. And that money doesn't stay in the neighborhoods. It doesn't develop our infrastructure and doesn't strengthen our communities. So we need to look at all these things in our forthcoming conversations. And I really welcome this initiative, and I think it's a good first step. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Braden. Yeah, and I just wanted to say I really appreciated all those comments, and I think that it highlighted the reason why it's so important for us to have community advocates involved in the task force and in the process going forward, because they've done so much work to think about how this program could work better on the community benefit side, and because they have so much experience on what our city really needs. And I wanted to, because she got cut off time-wise, I wanted to highlight something that Cortina said about MAHA's STASH program, which is a first generation homeownership support matching savings program. Because I do think that's an example to me of something where, as she mentioned, Children's Hospital supported that in its inception. So it's, it's an example of something where you're talking about a community benefit, but it's targeted at closing the racial wealth gap, and 97% of the participants are people of color. And it actually, right, like it actually gets folks into homes and building equity. And I think that's, to me, I said at the beginning that, COVID, I think, was a real eye opener for us. And one of the things was that there were real metrics. There was a real sense of like, where are we on hospital beds? Where are we on, infections in the city? Folks, who are recovering or not. And I just think that there's so many of our other crises in the city, whether it's housing affordability or educational opportunity or the wealth gap, where the proof is in the pudding. And if we can kind of make our whole community benefits ecosystem, community-led and targeted on outcomes, that would make a big difference. So grateful. Thank you to the whole pilot action group, which has had a major role in educating both the council and the public on this issue. And as was mentioned earlier, we have an extensive report from them, which has been shared with all the councilors, and which we're happy to continue to share with members of the public. So if you want that, just reach out, ccc.pilot@boston.gov, and we'll get you a copy. Mindful of time, I am going to go next to the institutional panel so that we have heard from all three of our panels. So if folks will just give me a second to let folks in. And then I'm also mindful of the folks who have been waiting patiently for public testimony. Give me one sec. There we are. All right, so joining us now for our third panel, we have Tish McMullen, who's the Executive Director of the Conference of Boston Teaching Hospitals, Carl Sciotino, the co-chair of the Boston DHNA CHIP Collaborative. Carl, I'll let you explain the acronym. And then Rob McCarran, the president of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in Massachusetts, also known as AICUM. And just before they go, I will just note again that we've received written testimony additionally. So they're sort of speaking on behalf of a few of the different sectors who participate in the pilot program. But we have also received written testimony from Boston University, Fenway Alliance, Masco, Harvard, Northeastern University, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and also there's a joint letter from sort of 7 of the largest cultural organizations, the Museum of Science, Aquarium, Children's Museum, Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston Symphony Orchestra, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and the Museum of Fine Arts. So that's just a note that in addition to the folks that you're hearing from today, we've got a lot of written testimony, and it's part of the record. All counselors have received it, and you can also receive it as a member of the public if you reach out. So without further ado, and with thanks for your patience, I want to go to Tish McMullen from the Conference of Boston Teaching Hospitals.
Good afternoon, Counselor Bach. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you great.
Great.
Nice to see you.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting us today to speak to the community benefits programming and community engagement that our teaching hospitals are engaged in on a daily basis. My name is Tish McMullen. I am the Executive Director of the Conference of Boston Teaching Hospitals, a nonprofit that brings together teaching hospitals across Greater Boston to collaborate together in a number of areas, including community benefits, research, emergency preparedness, emergency medical services, and other areas. We are privileged to partner with the Boston Public Health Commission, the Office of Health and Human Services, and Boston EMS in a number of these areas. We've shared with you a recent report that we pulled together to provide an important snapshot of the robust community benefits programming that our hospitals are engaged in across a wide variety of areas, including workforce development, violence prevention, intervention and response, and community health and wellness. These programs are informed by robust community engagement and community health needs assessments, that's the CHNA, that guide our activities and investments in priorities that are identified by the community, that respond to the lived experience and needs of Boston neighborhoods, and that represent an overarching commitment to achieving racial and ethnic health equity. These programs also strategically match the resources and expertise of our teaching hospitals with the identified needs of Boston neighborhoods that surround them and reach every neighborhood in the city of Boston. While the past year has been extraordinarily difficult for our institutions, for our patients and their families, and our extraordinary frontline workforce, we remain deeply committed to the City of Boston pilot program with wide-scale participation across the hospitals. Throughout the pandemic, our institutions doubled down on our long-held and deep relationships and commitment to the patients and communities we serve throughout the city. We partnered with community-based organizations and local government on testing and vaccination clinics to ensure access to nutritious food and to care for the city's most vulnerable residents in need of care, respite, or isolation. And we unleashed the full power of our research enterprises to identify treatments, vaccines, and therapeutic strategies intended to heal each and every patient in our care. And we have more work to do. Since the pilot program's inception in 2012 and through FY 2019, our hospitals have contributed more than $117 million in cash contributions to the city and expended at least $137 million in community benefits programs that directly benefit City of Boston residents. Our hospitals also participate in a larger community-driven collaborative, and you will hear more about that. We are convinced that the success of the city's voluntary pilot program to date stems from a sense of shared responsibility, partnership, and collaboration we have maintained with our partners in the City of Boston. At the program's inception, we came together with a shared sense of purpose and a shared sense of responsibility. Nonprofit organizations, labor, community members, and many other stakeholders worked together over many months to create a transparent, reliable, accountable, and voluntary pilot program that recognizes both the city's fiscal needs as well as the unique charitable and economic contributions of the nonprofit sector to our surrounding neighborhoods. That sense of shared purpose and shared responsibility, as well as continued stakeholder collaboration, will be the hallmark of the program's continued and future success. We are open to continued efforts to make community engagement and community benefits efforts more transparent to both the city and the communities we serve, and we look forward to continued engagement with you on this important issue. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Patricia. Next up is Carl Shortino. Carl?
Good afternoon, Councilor Bach and members of the committee. Thank you for having me testify this afternoon. I'm Carl Shortino. I'm the Executive Vice President for External Relations at Fenway Health. We're a federally qualified health center in the Fenway neighborhood. But I'm here on behalf of the Boston Chennault CHIP Collaborative. The Chennault CHIP Collaborative is the Community Health Needs Assessment and Community Health Improvement Plan Collaborative. That's what the acronym stands for. It's a bit of a mouthful. Apologies for that. But I wanted to share this because I think it gives some context to what I think is a really unique and positive example of community engagement that's leading to priorities and decision-making by institutions that are members of the collaborative. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of this project this year. The mission and vision of the collaborative is essentially to make sure that we can achieve sustainable, positive change in the health of Boston by collaborating with communities, sharing knowledge, aligning resources, and addressing root causes of inequity. That's the mission statement of the collaborative itself. And when I looked at the order for this hearing, the reference to the community benefits process set up by the AG for social determinants of health for the hospitals and community engagement requirements, as well as the requirements that are applied to community health centers and the Boston Public Health Commission for our own regulations and requirements, brought us together as a collaborative to make sure that we are in a unified way engaging with the community to assess the needs of the community and understand how we can make a more impactful result by actually working together in this process. So the collaborative came together in 2018. The community health needs assessment was started in 2018. The community health improvement plan was done in 2019. And then 2020 was the first year of implementation, which was quite challenging during COVID, but I'll share with you what each of those steps in the process was for us. In terms of who makes up the collaborative, the steering committee itself is a total of 19 members, which includes members from hospitals, community health centers, public health officials, including from the Boston Public Health Commission, community development organizations, and community representatives. And in addition to the collaborative's steering committee itself, through the community health needs assessment, we engaged over 90 organizations in gathering feedback from the community citywide to make sure that we were doing a robust community engagement process. That included looking at secondary data from the city itself, a variety of surveillance systems and sources. We did a number of interviews, 45 interviews of organizational and community leaders across sectors. We had focus groups with a number of community members, 13 focus groups in total, including in multiple languages. And we did a community survey that reached over 2,400 residents. So we were trying to really, in a genuine way, reach a large sector of the community, get representation, in particular from those that usually are underserved and underheard through these kinds of engagement processes. And the collective impact of us doing that together made that possible. The full report, the Community Health Needs Assessment, is available on the bostonchnah.org website. It really is, not surprisingly, a comprehensive assessment of the needs of our community focused on social determinants of health. There were a number of social, economic, and health concerns identified that really emerged through this process, all of which impact our community's health. And not shocking to any one of us, I would say, is the disproportionate impact on BIPOC communities, low-income residents, immigrant communities, and other populations such as youth, seniors, and LGBTQ residents. And what we found through this process, and again, I would say not surprising, but it was interesting to actually put numbers and stories to this assumption and perception of our community, is that there are significant structural and economic inequalities and institutional racism. And these were themes that were discussed through most of this process and became drivers of our work going forward and are frankly the drivers of the disparities we're seeing today in our city. So after we did the community health needs assessment, we turned to creating a community health improvement plan, which is essentially saying, okay, we now know what the needs are. What do we do about that? How can we begin to make more of a collective impact together in addressing the needs that we've identified? So the community health improvement plan, similar to the development of the needs assessment, was a community engagement process. We did a really democratically engaged community engagement process to make sure that we understood what we were hearing from residents. We shared back with residents and stakeholders what we learned through the needs assessment, and then developed 4 focus areas: housing, financial security and mobility, behavioral health, and accessing services, or barriers to accessing services. And the overarching theme of the community health improvement plan is to achieve racial and ethnic health equity. And again, I don't think that's surprising for any of us in this space, that racial and ethnic health equity are the issues to focus on when you look at disparities that we see in the community. But we really drilled down into those 4 areas: housing, financial security, mobility, behavioral health, and accessing services, in terms of what it means to actually make improvements in those areas with a lens towards racial and ethnic health equity. And again, these priorities were developed in a robust community engagement process. So the last thing I'll share is that this was the first go around to do this kind of joint effort. The hospitals were a minority on the steering committee. It was non-hospital representatives that were the majority of the steering committee itself that laid out the process. But obviously it was a joint partnership with all of us at the table. And we learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work to do this kind of collaborative effort. I think it was really effective in the way we were able to engage residents across the city and ended up with a real focus on communities, neighborhoods, and populations that are typically underserved and often unheard. And right now, the findings of that process are informing institutional decision-making and prioritization of community benefits at independent institutions, as well as at the collaborative as a whole, as we do our work together. So I wanted to offer this testimony just to provide some context about this particular project, where the collaborative effort with a range of institutions and stakeholders came together and are working together to address community needs with a focus on equity. So I appreciate the time to share that experience that we've had over the last several years.
Great, thank you so much, Carl. And lastly, Rob McCarron from AICUM.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Bach and Vice Chair Flaherty and other members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to briefly address the important role that private nonprofit colleges and universities play in making Boston such a vibrant place to live, learn, and work. My name is Rob McCarron. I serve as president of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in Massachusetts, which represents the public policy interests of 61 private nonprofit colleges and universities throughout the Commonwealth. AICUM has 18 member institutions that are proud to call Boston home. They're equally proud to leverage their unique missions and strengths to contribute in so many ways to the educational, cultural, and innovation fabric of the city. Together, these 18 institutions educate thousands of Boston residents, ensure access to higher education by providing tens of millions of dollars in financial aid, employ over 10,000 Boston residents with campus-based jobs and benefits, support Boston-based businesses by spending nearly $2 billion each year on goods and services, pay tens of millions of dollars in real estate taxes and other taxes, and attract nearly $2 billion in federal research dollars in collaboration with affiliated teaching hospitals. The colleges and universities in Boston also anchor our regional economy and serve as magnets for attracting students, researchers, and faculty who then contribute their individual and collective talents to Boston and contribute to the economy. Over decades, these institutions have developed extensive partnerships with Boston schools and nonprofits throughout the city that enhance the daily lives of Boston residents. The impact of these collaborations extend across every neighborhood in Boston, and they reflect ongoing bidirectional dialogues between campus and community. As is well documented in the community benefits reports that are submitted to the city, colleges and universities provide essential services that enhance the social well-being of Boston residents, and in doing so, perform a number of critical functions that would otherwise need to be funded through the city's annual budget. These services range from pro bono legal clinics for residents dealing with housing insecurity or immigration issues, annual eye exams for K-12 students, free cultural events throughout the city, summer camps for Boston residents, partnerships with local food pantries, green space improvements and annual maintenance, and so much more. These programs may be difficult to financially quantify, but they are invaluable to those who benefit from them. The 18 colleges and universities in Boston have been integral contributors to the city since their inception. And while this is true year over year, and as Tish described, it has never been more true over the past year. Colleges and universities were at the forefront of the response to COVID-19 by partnering with the state, the city, and nonprofit organizations to provide critical services throughout the pandemic. They turned over dorms to house patients, first responders, and the homeless. They donated PPEs, facilities, and equipment, and directed other healthcare contributions. They worked quickly to reopen labs in order to drive the ecosystems of innovation. And these are the same ecosystems that helped to develop the foundational research that led to the vaccine. In addition, these same institutions invested over $250 million in a COVID surveillance testing program that allowed for safe return to campus, maintained critical employment, student financial aid, and local spending. In fact, since last August, the colleges and universities in Massachusetts have conducted 10 million COVID tests. We would not be where we are in terms of a recovery as a city and a state without the efforts of and collaboration between the colleges and universities and our nonprofit partners in healthcare. AICUM members are committed to continuing their partnerships throughout Boston in a manner that best leverages their unique missions and strengths. This work is most impactful when colleges and universities and the community partners are empowered to work together to deliver essential mission-based services to those who need it most. We welcome Mayor Gianni's announcement today to convene a task force of all stakeholders to see how we might improve a voluntary pilot program that is already described today as an outstanding success. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. McCarron, and to all three of you. I appreciate, Carl, the update because I've been mentally meaning to check in. I didn't know the acronym, but I think, obviously the determination of needs process itself was one step, and then the idea of like coordinating it's another. And I think one of the things that we consistently hear from community members you know, it's both that folks want a voice in determining here, and also that in a lot of ways, like, I mean, you heard it from the community members on the panel before us, like, we already know what the challenges are and community folks have articulated them. And so it's sort of like, how do we get down to business and not just like, you know, constantly go in circles. So I think if there are ways for this process to go in a direction that also, like, you know, piggybacks on some of that coordination and listening that's happened through the hospital's process, you know, so much the better in terms of getting down to the work ahead. So I appreciate that. And definitely, and Rob, I mean, obviously you listed some of the specific things I was thinking of in terms of the COVID response, but it's been a real all hands on deck thing. And we're just trying to figure out how to keep all hands on deck. But no,
has been. Thank you.
but I might have a question or two, but I just want to check first with my colleague, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Mejia, did you have any questions or comments you wanted to raise? You're muted.
Of course. It would not be Zoom unless someone was muted. No, I just wanted to thank everyone for their testimonies. I am curious though, Rob and Patricia, you know, hearing the testimonies from some of the advocates that spoke before you, just kind of when you hear the sense of, or at least the I wouldn't say lack of regard, but there seems to be a disconnect between what we're hearing from advocates and then what we're seeing in terms of the outcomes. And I'm just curious what kind of conversations are being had from our colleges and our institutions in particular, because Cortina had mentioned that there are a lot of folks right now who have been displaced from the city of Boston, but yet still have to commute to work here in the city of Boston. And when I think about community benefits, you know, sometimes we just look at people who are still living here in the city. The harm has been done to those who have been displaced as a result of the development that's happening. So I'm just curious what, if any, conversations are being had in the university level around how do we reconcile with that?
Sure, thank you, Councillor. I can tell you the conversations that are happening, particularly as we start to emerge from the kind of the real disruptions and uncertainties of COVID. Our board has and our presidents have charged us with focusing on two issues. It's justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity, and mental health. And they very much want us to Chair Bach's sentiment, to build on the collaborative environment that evolved in responding to COVID and doing what we were able to do to create basically a national model of testing and contact tracing and helping to try to contain the virus, but take that collaborative model and apply it to the issues that you referenced. And that is what we've been charged with doing. We're meeting next week to talk further about it, and we're trying to be responsive on both of those fronts.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in regards to some of the small businesses that Nia talked about in terms of economic justice, when we think about racial justice, I mean, a lot of these words that we hear these days, equity sometimes loses its focus. And I'm just curious in terms of just kind of, if you could just break it down, what is community benefit?
Councilor Mejia, you're going in and out. Sorry, Councilor Mejia, can you say that last sentence again? We lost.
Can you hear me?
You might turn off your video. Yeah, why don't you go? Just repeat that last bit again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just talking about the fact that we often hear the word equity and racial equity and all of this. And I'm just curious if we could just put some dollars behind that. What does that look like? And I know this is not the hearing for that level of accountability, but what are we going quickly around economic development? That's also a priority for us to lean into. Internet is really bad, and so this way for university really that bad.
Counselor
Counselor Bach, you
Mejia.
can't hear me at all.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think from the sort of every other word that the basic just, do you want me to try to summarize? Sorry, Counselor Mejia, we really can't hear you. All right, we may get her back. I think the gist of it was that we, it's good to talk about racial equity, but where are we actually getting and employing businesses and thinking about, oh, here she is. Do you want to try it one more time?
Oh, yes. No one's going to silence me. We need to talk about this digital equity as an issue too, that I think that universities need to be able to lean into just a little bit more. I think that that's something that I'd like to advocate for, but I was just really leaning in on the whole racial equity piece. We talk a lot about that these days. And, I'd love for this task force to really come out with some recommendations in terms of dollars and how we're going to hold ourselves accountable to these deliverables as it relates to housing, economic development, workforce. All of these things are interconnected. And I know, I forget who it was, but we were talking about the social determinants of health. And I think that those who are causing the harm should work in collaboration with those who are experiencing the harm so that we can find some common ground. And I think that the universities that are in our neighborhoods, and we definitely do appreciate them here, but I would love to move beyond scholarships and employment opportunity. Those things are great, but I think that we need to be a little bit more aggressive when we're looking at the housing stock, when we're looking at development, when we're looking at the fact that so many people can no longer afford to live here, but yet have to commute and work in the city of Boston. And I think that there needs to be some conversation about how we're going to support these folks who have to travel 2 hours just to get to work because they can no longer afford to live here in Boston. There needs to be that level of conversation when we're thinking about this task force, and those accountability measures need to be a part of this conversation.
I agree with you, Counselor Mejia, and the Chinat CHIP Collaborative includes in the CHIP implementation plan a real commitment to tackle a whole number of issues around the housing crisis, really. And so happy to share that with your office. But we also know it's a challenge that needs government, private industry, business. We all have to work on that piece together. Some of what the CHIP is focused on is advocacy, which we are doing quite a bit of in that space. So thank you for raising that, and happy to work with you on that.
Great. Counselor Mejia, you all set?
For now.
Okay, thank you. Counselor Flynn?
Thank you, Councilor Block. Apologize for being late. I had a previous commitment, so I apologize to the people that testified already. So I won't ask questions because I'm sure they were already answered. So maybe I'll just try to make a general statement instead. What I would like to see is the impact the pilot program has on the residents of the city as we see a booming economy pre-pandemic. But are those jobs, is that housing, are we giving back enough to residents to make sure that Boston's a livable city for them, that there are training opportunities for residents of Villa Victoria? Are there options for kids from Mary Ellen McCormick to go to these colleges? What type of job training programs do we have for kids in Roxbury and Dorchester, and youth sports programs as well? So one thing I would like to see is, a kind of a detailed list of exactly what colleges, universities, nonprofits, hospitals, what they actually do and give, but also some follow-up on that. You know, maybe a college gives 100 scholarships annually to kids from the city. But of those kids, of those students, how many of them graduate in 4 years? How many of them leave the college after 1 year or 2 years? What type of public health services are we providing to residents in Chinatown that have the highest asthma rate of any neighborhood in Massachusetts? So there's a lot of issues and questions I have, and would like to get some answers. Maybe now is not the time, but at some point I would like to get into the weeds on exactly what the nonprofits are doing and the impact they're having on the residents of the city. Thank you, Councilor Bach, and I also want to acknowledge that the nonprofits play a critical role in our city. They add to our economy. They put people to work. They invest in our city. They make our city a world-class city. And they're a key part of the future of Boston. Having said that, let's also factor in how they're benefiting and how they're providing services appropriately to the residents of Boston. So at some point, Councilor Bach, I would like to have a discussion with someone that could walk me through that.
Great. No, thank you so much, Councilor Flynn. And I think we'll forward that question to Casey Brock Wilson, who is here from the administration. And I think it just really underscores, the administration announced today they're going to launch a sort of, 10 years on new pilot task force. And I think the idea of, what data is informing that conversation about how we make this community benefits process better is really important. And you just raised some of the same things I feel about outcomes, right? And we're being really outcome oriented. And I think that's where a lot of some of what Carl and others were talking about that's the direction things have gone in general. So I'm excited about that. I am mindful it's 5 o'clock and we have some very patient members of the public who have been on since the start of this hearing. So I think unless another counselor has a question, then I'm going to thank our third panel and get to public testimony. Is there anybody from the panel who wants to make a final remark?
Councilor Bach, could I just ask, could you answer what is the next step in this process in terms of certainly public testimony, but what is the follow-up and what is our next step in terms of a meeting and who we're meeting with and what information will the council receive that they may have requested on some of these topics?
Yeah, sure. So Councilor Flynn, what the administration said was that they want to convene a new pilot task force with stakeholders from all groups, including, the pilot action group, community, the institutions, universities, hospitals, cultural institutions, the administration itself, the council. But they didn't yet have sort of exactly who's on that body. And some of the questions that were raised in the prior part of this conversation were just about, exactly what the timeline and metrics and stuff of that group will be. So, I think, and I know that the pilot action group, I think, is going to forward some suggestions to the administration as well on that front. So I think where we're at in terms of next steps is kind of them taking a bunch of the feedback back today, the counselor questions, Counselor Edwards asked a bunch of questions, and kind of coming back to us with what the proposed membership and structure of that task force is. But what they did articulate was the goal was to get folks around the table to talk about the program with over the next kind of 6 to 8 months, with the goal being to have recommendations in place before the FY23 fiscal year. So obviously we're entering FY22 now. And as you know, because you were part of the counselors who signed the letter last summer, the administration last fall agreed to do a revaluation, right, of all the exempt property. And so they're in the middle of that right now. So the thought is also that let them sort of finish that out over the calendar year and get a group talk in. And so, Yeah, so, but I think certainly on the committee front, one of the things that we can do is follow up concretely with Casey about the question you were asking. So I'll make sure we do that.
Thank you, Council Block, and thank you to the panelists that are here as well.
Great, thank you so much. And Rob, did you want to say a word before I go to public
Just want to
testimony?
say thank you. That was all.
Great, thank you so much for being with us. And to everybody for being with us. And now I do want to go to public testimony. So I'll just be taking it in the order I've got in front of me here. So first up will be Richard Giordano from the Fenway CEC, which is also part of the Pilot Coalition, and then Pam Coker from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. Just so you know, I see Craig, Paul, Ruby, Justin, Lydia, Sharon, all here as well. So I will be coming to everybody in order, but we'll start with Rich. So Rich, if you could just identify yourself and just make a couple of minutes of comments. Rich. There you are.
Sorry about that. I had a little trouble unmuting myself. Do you hear me all right?
We hear you and we see you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I will try and submit more formal written testimony in the next few days. I do want to thank Councilor Bach, obviously, and all the other councilors and the mayor for all of the work that's currently been done to improve the process that we're all talking about, the pilot program. We really do appreciate the new task force that will be getting formed. I would like to, however, say that we do need to continue to remind ourselves of the full history of how we got here, and the good and the bad. And I think most of you remember that the way the pilot system works, it's based on an assessed value, and universities and hospitals are allowed to or have agreed to pay up to 25% of the assessed value, and then they can offset that with community benefits. It should be noted for the discussion, however, that the assessment, which is going on right now in 2021, is 5 years overdue. And what that means is that the universities and the hospitals have been either paying more or less of what has been asked of them on a value that is significantly underrepresenting their real estate. The original process that got started in 2009, 10, and 11 suggested that the valuation should occur every 5 years. There was no reevaluation of the real estate holdings in the 5-year period beyond that. And so here we are in 2021, faced with the fact that everything that we're discussing about how well or how poorly the institutions have behaved is based on insignificant or faulty figures. The real estate value is completely undervalued, and in fact has missed a huge building boom on all of the institutions in the city. So not only are we assessing on value that is 10 years out of date, but we've missed an enormous amount of real estate value that's been built in the last 5 years in particular. Why does that affect us all? Well, not only are we then not getting a correct valuation, whatever is being offset in community benefits is also being undercounted in a sense. The benefits are being based on an outdated tax assessment. So whether or not we argue that they are or aren't fulfilling their obligation, we have to admit that the obligation is not the correct obligation. And we're only now in 2021 getting to the root of correcting that. And regarding community benefits and the need for a robust set of guidelines and an evaluation process, I would just suggest that one of the things that needs to be addressed along with the magnificent impacts that many of our institutions have on the city, there are also some deleterious ones. Universities in particular, as was pointed out by the testimony from Alston Brighton, have been responsible for practically decimating certain neighborhoods like Alston Brighton, Fenway, and Mission Hill in terms of the housing stock. We have almost, according to the University Accountability Report of 2018-2019, 15,000 students living in Mission Hill and the Fenway alone. This is in part due to the fact that universities don't build enough dorms and don't take into account the impact that they have on communities. And what's that impact? Well, effectively, they've been responsible for displacing thousands of families and residents over the last 2 decades, while the change in educational models have gone on from commuting to national and international student body. So when we look at community benefits or assessments, we really do have to look at the whole range of where we are now and admit that that's where we are while we try to improve and go forward. And I just might remind everybody that every institution that doesn't pay taxes on their real estate value, they're in a very unique position because all the affordable housing organizations in the state pay real estate taxes on their affordable housing. And so the obligation that we have could be looked at as a model for what the institution should be thinking about. So I'll end at that, and thank you very much for the time, and wish all the rest of the residents a good time to discuss their issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rich. Next up is Pam Coker, and from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. And then it'll be Lydia Lowe, the director of the Chinatown Land Trust, and then Craig Coogan. Pam? Yeah. Pam? Oh, there we are. Great.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to speak about this very important program for both the city financially and for the community. I want to share some of the points that we think should be considered as part of any conversation about this program, particularly when discussing making any changes to the pilot program. The pilot program in Boston originated as a partnership with the city and our non-profit institutions, and that has been maintained over many years. This partnership has been critical to Boston's economy, to addressing many acute social and educational issues in the city, as well as to the pilot program and to Boston's reemergence as in a post-COVID environment. We encourage that the Boston city government and Boston community continue to work in partnership with the many universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions that contribute millions of dollars and countless community benefits to the city each year, which will continue strengthening the program for years to come. Essential to this collaboration is a seat at the table in any conversations about program changes, a seat at the table for not only city government leaders, but also for those very organizations participating in the program. We also recommend an annual program evaluation. The program should be evaluated annually to ensure program effectiveness and make adjustments as needed, avoiding the need for dramatic overhauls every few years. Systematic annual review process would improve transparency into the pilot community benefit effectiveness and how those benefits are financially evaluated. Now, in fiscal year 2020, the city received about $34 million in cash contributions, an increase over the previous year's cash contributions, despite concerns about financial sustainability caused by the pandemic. Together, 37 institutions went above and beyond these cash contributions and reported $153 million in cash and in-kind community benefit programs to city residents all across the neighborhood. Again, even at a time of concern about pandemic impact on all organizations and community members in the city. One thing to note, based on conversations that we've had earlier today during this hearing, is to just note that it is the city that decides each year which community benefit programs are to be counted as credits for an institution's pilot program. That's not designated by the contributing institutions themselves. That is set by the city. Now, all of these institutions that we're talking about today have long played key roles in attracting visitors to the city, employing residents, and keeping Boston's economy strong. And they will continue to be essential to the city's economic recovery and to Boston residents' well-being in the wake of the pandemic and well into the future. Therefore, the city should continue to prioritize cooperative and flexible partnerships as it reflects on its management of the pilot program. Now, the Research Bureau has previously proposed a couple of things that the city might want to consider to help address some of the challenges in terms of revenue. One thing we want to reference is a shared state income tax policy with the Commonwealth for employees of these institutions. What that would mean is that the Commonwealth, although it receives even greater benefit from our tax-exempt medical and educational institutions, because unlike Boston, the state is the beneficiary of the income tax paid by all employees of these institutions. We might consider perhaps that some sort of revenue sharing opportunity would stipulate that a percentage of the 5% state income tax generated by the employees of these institutions would be allocated to the city of Boston, where the employees in their institutions are concentrated. So just one idea to throw out. It's something the Research Bureau has spoken about before, and it'd be another opportunity related to this program that could provide some opportunity for the city, some revenue opportunity in particular for the city. We also want to reference that tax-exempt institutions already financially contribute to the city apart from the program in a number of ways, including paying property taxes when they acquire new properties that were previously taxable, even if the building's new use is a tax-exempt one. In fact, past city assessing data has shown that in addition to pilot payments, tax-exempt institutions pay many millions of dollars a year in property taxes for both commercial and for also officially exempt property uses each year. We want to reference as well that pilot institutions also pay linkage fees to the city when developing property for uses falling under the BPDA's definition of direct impact uses. And when a pilot institution builds a new development in conjunction with a private developer on institution-owned land, the funding structure requires the developer to pay full annual property taxes to the city, cutting down on the city's total tax-exempt land area. Nonprofits also pay permit fees for construction and other services, just like private sector organizations do in the city. So just a little reminder of the larger look at what these anchor institutions are doing within and with the city. So as well as that, just want to emphasize one or two more things. Predominantly, what we are continuing to look for when it comes to this program going forward. I just want to re-emphasize that the pilot program has been successful and further improved over the years because of these cooperative partnerships. And again, essential is a seat at the table, and the work should be continued by building upon the work done to date with this program, particularly since 2012, and can continue to thrive if there is recognition that these tax-exempt entities do not have to provide anything, but have a long record now of contributing in a number of ways to the city. And we can speak to hospitals as well as the universities, which support the city directly through grant awards to the Boston Public Schools for health and wellness and early childhood education and behavioral health programs. While faculty and department leaders Universities are actively involved in training middle and high school teachers and making STEM education more accessible to underserved students. Hospitals also work extensively with each other and community groups and follow through under guidelines provided by the Affordable Care Act, so federal level, Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and the Attorney General's guidelines for community engagement. And federal and state regulations also require hospitals to abide by certain standards when implementing and reporting on community benefit programs. And that includes attention to equity issues and concerns. So thank you for your time today. I'll be happy to take any questions. We will be submitting written testimony that provides a lot more detail on these recommendations and the emphasis that I have made today on certain aspects of our testimony. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Great, thank you so much, Pam. Yes, and please do send that. We are going to be sharing all the written testimony related to this hearing, also with the administration as they think about the task force. So we would be very grateful for that. Next up is Lydia Lowe, the director of the Chinatown Land Trust. Then it'll be Craig Coogan, and then it will be Ruby Reyes. Lydia.
Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to testify. I want to support and echo some of the points made by the Pilot Action Group in the panel earlier. But from the particular point of view of Chinatown, Chinatown lies in the shadow of two institutions, which were the biggest drivers of land loss and displacement from the 1960s up through the early 1990s, before the more recent phase of luxury development and gentrification. Today, the COVID pandemic has left thousands of residents unemployed in overcrowded or unstable housing, and with dozens of small businesses shuttered. Chinatown's proximity to Tufts Medical Center, Tufts University, Emerson College, Suffolk University, and New England School of Law has made it an attractive neighborhood for graduate students. Tufts in particular has enjoyed one of the largest increases in its student population in recent years. And in contrast to undergrad students, about 66% of grad students are living independently off campus. So in the past decade or more, we've seen more and more privately owned multi-unit buildings in Chinatown, which once housed working class families, become essentially privately run student dorms. In fiscal 2020, Tufts University paid a $450,000 cash contribution and was credited with $613,719 in community benefits. Some of those community benefits included free use of facilities, need-based financial aid for students, BPS students, contributions to community organizations, donated supplies, and low-cost dental care. And Tufts has also made progress in linking student volunteers and researchers with particular community needs. During this same time, Tufts Medical Center paid over $1.6 million for its full pilot cash contribution and provided the equal value in community benefits through programs like nutrition, physical activity counseling, and anti-tobacco programs. Those contributions are very important, and these institutions need to not only contribute their full pilot contributions, but they should also be working more closely with communities to develop a collaborative strategy and plan for community stabilization and an equitable recovery. Imagine what would be possible if the city, neighborhood organizations, and all of the institutions were planning together how to address upstream social determinants of health, such as the housing and displacement problem or today's unemployment crisis. In this next phase, anchor institutions could be a major driver for an equitable recovery. Can some of our hundreds of laid off hotel cleaners and laundry workers be put to work at the institutions? Can struggling restaurants in Chinatown become the new institutional food vendors? How can community organizations and the institutions plan together to increase affordable housing and keep people in their homes? I want to thank Mayor Janey and the administration for initiating the new pilot task force as had been advocated by the Pilot Action Group, and I look forward to learning more about how community members can participate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lydia. Next up is Craig Coogan, the Executive Director of the Boston Gay Men's Chorus, and then Ruby Reyes, as I said, and then Dr. Paul Haddis. Craig?
Good afternoon. My name is Craig Coogan. I'm the Executive Director of the Boston Gay Men's Chorus. I use the he series pronouns. We are impacted by Pilot, as are all small organizations and artists. It's indirect. We interact with larger institutions. Pilot fees trickle down to us in the form of increased rent for rehearsal and performance spaces. Until 2011, the city negotiated pilot payments individually and only requested them of the largest organizations. The Menino administration instituted the current policy that resulted in a handful of Boston's largest arts and cultural nonprofits being expected to make pilot payments or to be called out publicly by the city for not doing so. I'm not sure how voluntary the program is, with city efforts to increase oversight and collect more funds. A 2015 Boston Foundation report noted that in fiscal 12, the city collected $187,000 from arts and cultural nonprofits in pilot fees, while investing just $130,000 in its budget for arts and culture grants. Boston holds the distinction of being the only city in the country that requests funding from arts and culture nonprofits. If the City Council believes that arts and charitable organizations are more a drain on local resources than what we contribute to the public good, the answer isn't to undermine tax law. Charities of all sizes have been exempted from federal, state, and local income tax since the late 1890s because of the value that we public benefit corporations provide to society through our core mission work. If you disagree, fine. The solution is to address the issue through the legislative process at the state and federal level, and not trying to solve long-standing equity and housing issues on the backs of artists. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Coogan. Next up is Ruby Reyes, the Executive Director of the Boston Educational Justice Alliance, BEJA. And then it'll be Dr. Paul Haddis and then Justin Brown. Ruby?
Thank you. My name is Ruby Reyes, and I'm the Boston Educational Justice Alliance Director and resident of Dorchester. BEJA is a member of the Pilot Action Group as well. BEJA represents parents, students, and educators working to improve and preserve the Boston Public Schools. I represent one of two Bostons. There is a Boston of residents who pay their taxes, work 2 and 3 jobs to afford to live here, and have children who attend the Boston Public Schools. They want to find a place where their child can be safe, nurtured, and develop a love of learning. That's one Boston. The other Boston is the plush private colleges and universities where presidents have salaries of over $1 million a year, classrooms have smart boards, and small patches of grass that are manicured regularly. That is the other Boston. In one Boston, there are BPS school communities that every year have to go through the painful work of figuring out what they need to cut from their school budgets. For some, the school budgeting process means closing their library. For others, it means offering science through a cart, not a science teacher or in a science class. These are not budgeting options or choices that anyone should have to make. The Build BPS Stakeholders Group, of which BEJA is a part of, released a survey in April 2021 to assess basic school infrastructure, such as facilities, programs, and staff. The survey found that across the board, most BPS schools were missing basic things. The survey has shown that more than a third of students don't have a functioning library. Approximately 55% of students in K-8 and middle schools don't have a science lab, and about 8% of students in middle and K-8 schools don't have an art teacher. Through the pandemic, BPS schools closed, and our highest need students were left with no in-person services. Students with disabilities and English learners were hit the hardest. The community benefits part of the pilot program could have been instrumental in providing online learning tools, professional development, and support for better online access to families and school communities. BPS school psychologists had caseloads of over 1,500 students before the pandemic. Community benefits could have been instrumental. However, community benefits are not determined by the community or the need, but by the institution. The majority of Boston residents and children will not attend these colleges and universities, in large part because they can't afford them. The same colleges and universities that get to tell Boston residents and BPS school communities what they are willing to do and not do in community benefits also get to tell residents that they should be grateful for what they have been given. Beja asks that when you form this task force, you ensure that BPS parents are included. Our parents, families, and residents are directly impacted by these institutions and should determine their school needs. We also ask for community transparency. We have enough murky budgeting happening at the city and school level. We don't need this to be another non-transparent institution. There is an opportunity to fund all of our schools so that all of our students and all of our residents are able to have access to a quality, well-resourced education, and not just in one Boston. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ruby. Next up is Dr. Paul Haddis, a retired faculty member of the Tufts Medical School. And then it'll be Justin Brown, Sharon Hinton, Domingos DeRosa. Dr. Haddis?
Thank you, Councilor Bach. I am Paul Haddis. I'm a public health physician who recently retired from Tufts Medical School after a number of years. And I'm also formerly a commissioner on the state's Health Policy Commission. For over 30 years, I've been involved in the issue of hospital community benefits, including I was part of a pioneering effort at New York University back in 1990 that really tried to help move the community benefit concept from simply being about charity care to really a focus on demonstrable, planned efforts to improve community public health and address inequities. While we helped to redefine those expectations nationally, it's been really a continuing 30-year struggle to get the hospital field to really embrace those notions backed by a real resource commitment that goes beyond the four walls of their own organization. Even in Massachusetts, since the early to mid 90s, our Attorney General's office helped make us really a state leader in trying to reset expectations and move the healthcare field to a more public health focus. Our hospitals at times have really been slow, though, to respond in some important ways. For example, consistently absent their efforts has been more upstream investments in areas that we know are important for good health, like in stable housing for lower income people, adequate nutrition, safer street environment, to name a few important things. Not that there has been no investment there, but when you look at even what they self-report, it's been inadequate compared to really what their resources seem to be. They've also tended to maintain a go-it-alone strategy and hesitant to work together at a local or regional level. Now, there have been some important breakthroughs and improvements in recent years, and we heard Carl talk about, for example, in Boston, the Common Needs Assessment to help characterize issues and opportunities for community health improvement with community engagement in that process. But really, if you also listen carefully to what Carl said, there's been not that much follow through in working together on those identified problems to date. And the resource commitment to those efforts, especially the upstream kinds of ones, my colleague Enid Eckstein, we studied this at a state level in 2016, and then recently with more detailed data out of the AG's office, looked again and found that most hospitals in our state are really doing very little investment in social determinant area. And when you do find that commitment, it's usually driven by a DON legal obligation rather than a year in, year out commitment. And as we all know, DON commitments come, but they go. Now, COVID has possibly given new hope to the idea of collaboration, and our hospitals, to their credit, especially here in Boston, saw the importance and value of working together when the situation demanded it, and I applaud that. My hope would be that that spirit of collaboration, matched by firmer financial commitments year in and year out, could really breathe some life into the community benefit notions that we in some ways identified 30 years ago. Let me finish by saying I am very pleased to hear about the announcement of the task force today. And I know, Councilor Edwards and Mahida talked about some notions of accountability. The thing I want to say there is, while the city certainly probably has a role, and I realize it's a volunteer scheme in trying to set out sort of, some defined expectations. Don't underestimate the peer accountability that could happen across sectors and across actors, that if people coming together, and some of them, are making good both on their financial and their in-kind commitments on community benefits, perhaps in a planned way, maybe put pressure on others. And so with that, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Haddis. Next up, Justin, and then it'll be Sharon and Domingos. Justin?
Hi, thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Justin Brown, and I live in Brighton at 116 Englewood Avenue. I've lived in Brighton for about the last 20 years. I'm an elementary school teacher and a volunteer co-leader of the Allston Brighton node of 350 Mass, which is a statewide climate justice organization. As a longtime resident of Brighton, I've seen neighbors and community groups struggle with universities as they've expanded their institutional footprints and reach into the neighborhood. These institutions benefit from many city services paid for with taxpayer dollars, yet continually fail to pay their share in pilot. Community members, when told, are dismayed when they hear that elite institutions like Boston College, Harvard University, and Boston University are not meeting their obligations. Particularly shocking is BC's abysmal record with pilot, 23% of the requested amount and nothing in reported community benefits. And the fact that Harvard, with one of the biggest endowments in the world, one that grew by billions during the pandemic, has only paid 79% of the pilot request. These institutions should pay their fair share and be held accountable. Relatedly, both BC and Harvard are still institutionally invested in the fossil fuel industry. While scientists note record-setting amounts of greenhouse gas emissions that are stealing away the livable futures of their students, Harvard and BC continue to invest in the companies that extract, distribute, and burn fossil fuels. These institutions should be investing in the livability of their communities, not the continued destruction of the planet. Lastly, a pilot program should have a shared vision based on collective community-based input. Powerful institutions, developers, and city planners get diminished community engagement when there is no master plan or shared vision in place. That in turn makes it more difficult to disrupt systems that favor powerful institutions over the people who live next to them. For example, I've seen this firsthand in the ways that city planners have failed to require large projects in Allston Brighton, many of which are mere blocks from each other, to combine mitigation and community benefits. Additionally, Harvard University right now is reluctant to reveal its vision for large swaths of land in Allston, forcing neighbors to engage with their developers on a parcel by parcel basis. This is a structure that puts profits over people. The collective vision created by the pilot task force should center community members and their hopes for a healthy and resilient city and be supported by the institutions who pay it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Next up, Sharon.
Hi.
Hi. We can hear you.
My name is Sharon Hinton. I'm actually the president of Black Teachers Matter, an educator, parent, community activist, all this other stuff. I've sat here and listened. I've seen both sides of this pilot thing because I actually worked in colleges, and as most of you guys know, there is the strongest or the largest concentration per square mile of colleges and universities in Boston than any place else in the world. So when you're talking about funding Boston Public Schools based on taxes and there's so many people that are not homeowners, that's a problem. That's another conversation. So I had a couple of questions. Earlier, there were comments made about the same task force 10 years ago are going to be invited back. So my question is, how do you get different results if you have the same people at the table, although Boston supposedly is the gold standard for dealing with the pilot tax revenue situation? That's the first thing. Dana-Farber and Boston Symphony Orchestra actually fulfilled their pilot responsibilities, and they were evenly split between community benefits and fees, but they're the standard. Everybody else doesn't do that. So my question is the task force going to be largened? Because no offense, it was sort of a monochromatic kind of presentation with the people that are on the task force now. And as a lot of other people said, they want to see more diversity. So are we going to pick the usual suspects when we go for diversity that are already connected? Or how are we doing that moving forward? So I applaud the task force and city councilors and the acting mayor moving forward with this, but it's way overdue when you look at who paid and who didn't pay. So the other question, even though it's a voluntary program, are we still going to go get those taxes? Because if we were the IRS, which is like the KGB, they would get it, and they would get it no matter what. So are we going after that? The other question is, I definitely supported the pilot fees being mandatory, not voluntary, but I'm not sure how you're going to enforce that, especially with the budget constraints that you're trying to do in 2022 and 23. And we had year-end pandemics, and some of these, I mean, yeah, the hospitals and everything made a lot of money, but a lot of the schools didn't. And a lot of schools suffered because the students weren't there. So how are we going to balance that? Also, excuse me, there is 10 years ago, according to the plan, there was a mandate that the benefits should go to Boston residents. So how do you enforce that? And then I'm concerned that when the requirements for the pilot fees are enforced, that doesn't get passed on to the students and the homeowners. I mean, because if you go into a store and they raise the prices on you, the cost of doing business, and it gets passed down to consumers. So that's my concern. And what about the institutions that are dual municipalities like Harvard? Harvard's in Boston, but it's also in Cambridge. So how do we deal with those institutions that are in multiple locations? So I support what you guys are doing, but it's been happening for a long period of time. What some people consider to be transparency, not so much. What some people consider to be, you know, and Councilor Mejia always says, you know, all means all, and bring everybody to the table. And if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's not her saying, but I go for that. So I'm one of those people that's civically engaged, and I tend to be showing up in a lot of different places, but I don't necessarily tend to be invited to those spaces because I can be not so friendly sometimes. You know, I love everybody, but I'm not going for the BS. And it's been going on way too long. And I see, so the last point I'll make is that when the pilot fees are collected, they go into the general fund. So are we going to have transparency in terms of where that money goes and what happens to it? I mean, I was at Northeastern, so they were giving out, 85 scholarships to Boston Public School students, but I also know how much money Northeastern makes and how much of that doesn't get passed down to faculty. And the people at the top are making the money, the president, Aoun, Joseph Aoun, but who else is making this money? So if we're not sticking to the Boston residency and making sure that the people that are in these institutions are actually Boston residents and women of color, people of color and women, then where's this money really going? I think it's going back out. I would like to see the whole process transparent. I would like to see more Black, Indigenous, people of color in the decision-making, not just after fact, and looking at and I also support what Councilor Edwards and many other people and Councilor, excuse me, Mejia said in terms of the metrics. Let's find out the money, the numbers, like who's really going to be accountable. And I don't think it should be another 10 years before we actually hold people accountable. It should be on a regular basis, and there should be penalties that involve people possibly losing their nonprofit status, possibly, you know, being charged as a corporation. If you look into some of these hallways of some of these institutions, you'll see blah, 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 corporation, but they still benefit when they get a 100-year lease or a 99-year lease on these lands and taken away from the community. So I get it that it's a catch-22. The universities have to grab land to build dormitories, and if they don't, then they go into the communities, and then the homeowners, the developers, the landowners, because they can get X amount of money from students, you see 4 and 5 students in a room. And so that drives up the rent because they can get it. So, you know, this is a big mess, but I like the fact that you guys are tackling it, and however way I can help you, I'd love to do it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon, for those remarks. And finally, Domingos de Rosa.
Hi, guys. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you guys holding this hearing on this issue that we as Bostonians have faced for many, 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 many years, decades. My input for tonight is the fact that I want to echo what a lot of the counselors have already said and some of the community members. Me, as a concerned resident, I would like to be a part of the solution and part of the conversation to make sure that further conversations are had. We've always been kept out of these dialogues where, you know, as a BPS student, we had no clue what the pilot program was. My parents had no clue of that. I didn't even know there was a community benefit portion of that. And as I got older and got a little more wiser, I started to notice that, you know, a lot of these scholarships that they do give to Boston students, not all of us had access to it. And that's something that, you know, we need to change as a city as a whole. Not only that, but the fact that, you know, as everyone has said in this hearing, you know, when you hear about an institute like Harvard who brings in, you know, billions of dollars in endowment and then turn around, charges Boston students a fee to attend a sports event or even be a part of some of the programs that they offered, you know, it's troubling. It's troubling to not just me, but to others. This is why we sat on this call since 3 o'clock to make sure that we get our 2 minutes of fame. The city council is in a position now to actually move this conversation beyond one step. We can move this in more than just the right direction. We can show other cities across the United States how we can set tones on difficult conversations. Yes, we understand a lot of these universities are exempt from taxes, but at the same time, the property that they're trying to buy from the city belongs to the city. And we as a city can't continue to allow them, especially in Austin and Brighton, where they've taken up more than enough of the areas. Ruggles housing development, Northeastern has pushed into that area. Northeastern has taken Lower Roxbury and turned it into the South End, where we know that is Lower Roxbury, and that shouldn't have happened. We can't continue to allow these institutes to be manhandling the community, the residents. Same with in Mission Hill. You know, 9 out of 10 people that you speak to in Mission Hill, they're students. Same as the Fenway. I keep hearing about, you know, Austin, Brighton, Mission Hill, but the Fenway is saturated with different schools. You can barely go down the street in Fenway without seeing a group of students. And, you know, these individuals who come here, they're not paying excise taxes to use the streets. They're not paying property taxes like we who live here. And then they receive all the benefits. I've been to countless BC games and, you know, Boston Fire, Boston EMTs, incident after incident, countless incidents where they're there providing needed services. And, you know, that's a great thing that we do as a city, but at the same time, BC has to do more than just say, hey, you can come to a game, you know, for $10. I like to see more of our Boston Public School students actually be a part of their student body, and not only student body, but their sports teams. I haven't seen one Black or brown student from Boston receive a scholarship for any athleticism across any of these institutes. So I'll end at that, and I thank you guys, and I look forward to the next conversation, and hopefully it's soon. You know, 6 months goes by fast. Hopefully we can, you know, speak on this within the next, you know, 2 weeks.
Great. Thank you so much, Domingos, for that. And to everybody who testified and raised great questions and points and knowledge and experience. And before we close out, I just want to give my colleague, Councilor Mejia, a chance to say any final words.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that I stayed to the end. I always feel like, and it's true, and we have to figure out how we lead and how we create space for our public testimony to maybe sprinkle them throughout the hearing so that the administration, I'm sure they go back and listen. But I do think that we have an opportunity to really lean into this conversation, and I'm just grateful to all those who showed up. But I the more I engage in these type of conversations, the more I realize that walking out of these spaces with a real clear sense of where do we go from here. I heard, you know, the need for regular accountability, and I don't think 6 months. I think maybe every 3 months we need to be bringing people in and doing very similar to the way we do the Boston Jobs residency, right? Like, I think that level of intense accountability is what the pilot program and, you know, this initiative needs, Councillor Bach. And so I think the task force needs to set itself up with a framework that is going to really be accountable, and that the metrics are done in partnership with all of the advocates that were here, and that, you know, as Sharon said about being at the, you know, when I don't even think that it should just even be about being at the table these days. We need to start setting the menu and being really clear about what ingredients we're going to cook with, because sometimes people have allergic reactions to things that don't fit their palate. So I think that even looking at the ingredients that we're using to cook is that's the level of detail that these times require. So so thank you for hosting this, and God, it's after 5, almost 6. So thank you, and thank you all who showed up. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. And yes, thanks to everybody who stayed on all this time. And I will just also give the administration who has been on and taking notes on all this a last word as well before we gavel out. So Casey Brock Wilson, did you want to say anything?
Thanks, Councilor, and thanks to all the community members who testified. Been here taking copious notes in the background with all the suggestions, and looking forward to continuing the engagement on this as we move into the task force. So just appreciate all the thoughtful ideas, and will be helpful for us as I move forward. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Casey. And we'll also send over, as I said, all the written testimony that we got. Because yeah, I think this task force is exciting, but it'll only work with everybody really involved, everybody who is here today, and yeah, sort of clear frameworks and timelines and metrics. So thanks to all. And with that, I am announcing that this hearing of the Boston City Council's Pilot Agreements Committee is adjourned. Have a good night.